Luke Harper's hands were shaking when he lifted her. Not from the weight, she was barely a whisper in his arms, but from the look in her eyes. She was 6 years old, barefoot, her lips cracked white from thirst, her dress torn at the shoulder and caked with red Oklahoma dust. She held a small wooden rabbit so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. And she did not cry. She did not scream. She only looked up at him and whispered 4 words that split open something inside his chest that he thought had been sealed shut forever. "Are you leaving too?" Before we go any further into Ellie's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now. Tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Luke Harper had not spoken a real word to another human being in 11 days. He knew because he counted, not on purpose, but the way a man counts things when the silence gets loud enough. The notches on the fence post, the cracks in the barn wall, the number of times the wind changed direction before sundown. 11 days since he'd ridden into Dry Creek for supplies. 11 days since old Earl at the feed store had said, "Mornin', Luke," and Luke had nodded and handed over exact change without opening his mouth. 11 days was not a record. He'd gone longer before. After Sarah died, he went nearly a month. After little James, he stopped counting altogether. It was the horses that kept him sane, not because they answered back, but because they didn't ask questions. Caesar, his big black quarter horse, had a way of pressing his nose against Luke's shoulder on the mornings when the weight got heaviest. And Luke always figured that was enough. More than enough. More than most people had ever given him. That evening he was riding the northern fence line, checking for breaks after 3 days of dry lightning storms had cracked the earth and rattled the wire. The sun was coming down fast, bleeding orange across the flat horizon, and the heat was still mean even at that hour. The kind of July heat that sits on your shoulders like a man trying to hold you down. He smelled it before he saw it. Burnt wood, spoiled meat, something underneath that made Caesar toss his head and pull left. Luke held him steady, easy. He followed the smell east along the dry creek bed for about a quarter mile before the wagon came into view. One wheel was shattered. The canvas cover had caught fire at some point. The wooden ribs were charred black and collapsed inward. The wagon had tipped sideways off a rut in the trail and gone down hard, and whatever horses had been pulling it were long gone, the traces cut or broken. Luke swung down from Caesar and tied him to a juniper branch. He moved forward slowly. 2 bodies, man and woman. From the look of things, the wagon had rolled on them when it went over. It had been days, maybe 3. The July heat had not been kind. Luke pulled his hat off and held it at his side. He didn't know them, but he stood there a moment anyway, because a man deserved that much. Someone to pause. Someone to acknowledge that they had lived. He was already thinking about riding back to Dry Creek to fetch the sheriff when he heard it. A sound so small, he almost convinced himself it was the wind moving through the charred canvas. A creak. A shift of weight. He went still. There it was again. He moved around the far side of the overturned wagon. And that's when he saw her. She had wedged herself into a narrow gap between the wagon bed and a large flat rock, the kind of instinctive hiding that children do when the world stops making sense. She was 6 years old, maybe 7, small for her age, with dark tangled hair matted to her face. Her dress had been pale blue once, maybe. Now it was the color of the dust around her. Her feet were bare and cut in several places. Her lips were cracked so badly they had split at the corners. She was alive. She was staring at him, and she was holding a small wooden rabbit against her chest with both hands, like it was the last solid thing in the world. Luke crouched down slowly. He kept his hands visible. He'd learned that much from working with spooked animals. You don't move fast. You don't reach. You let them see your hands, and you let them decide. "Hey there," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped from 11 days without use. He cleared his throat. "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't move. "My name's Luke Harper. I got a ranch about 4 miles west of here." He paused. "You've been out here long?" "Nothing." "I'm going to get you some water." "I got a canteen on my horse, is that all right? Can I get you some water?" Her eyes tracked to Caesar and back to Luke. "He won't bite," Luke said. He's a little rude sometimes, but he won't bite." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a reaction, more like the tiniest acknowledgement that she had heard him. Luke stood slowly, walked back to Caesar, unhooked the canteen from the saddle, and returned. He crouched again at the same distance, held the canteen out in front of him, cap off. "Here, come get it if you want it. I ain't coming any closer till you're ready." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with a deliberateness that broke something in Luke's chest, not rushed, not desperate, just terribly careful, like a child who had learned that moving too fast got you hurt, she reached out and took the canteen. She drank in long, steady pulls. She coughed once, recovered, kept drinking. When she finally lowered it, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and held the canteen back out to him. "You can keep it," Luke said. She looked at the canteen. Then she looked at the two bodies beyond the wagon. "Those your folks?" Luke asked quietly. A pause that lasted a long time. Then she nodded. "I'm sorry," Luke said, and he meant it with everything in him. "I'm real sorry, miss." Her chin trembled once, just once. Then it stopped and went still, and Luke understood that this child had already used up whatever crying she had. She had been out here for days. She had already done all of that alone. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "Ellie," she said. Her voice was barely there. "Ellie Carter." "Ellie Carter," Luke repeated. "That's a good name. My mama named me Luke. She did a fine job." Ellie looked down at the wooden rabbit in her hands. She turned it over once, examining it like she needed to confirm it was still whole. "My papa made this," she said. "He made it for me when I was little." "It's real nice work," Luke said. "He was good with his hands." He was. She was quiet again. Then, without looking up, "Are you going to leave me here?" Luke's jaw tightened. He looked at this child, this tiny, filthy, cracked-lipped girl, sitting in the shadow of a ruined wagon next to the bodies of her parents, holding a wooden rabbit her dead father had carved for her, and felt something move through him that he had no name for. It wasn't pity exactly. It was older than that, heavier. "No," he said, "I am not going to leave you here." "Everyone says that," she said, still not looking at him. "I know they do, and then they leave." Luke was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I got a ranch 4 miles west. Got a barn with horses and a house with a roof that doesn't leak much. Got a kitchen with flour and salt pork, and probably some dried apples if the mice haven't got to 'em." He paused. "It's not much, but it's shelter and it's food, and I'm not in the habit of making promises I don't keep." She looked up at him then. Really looked. The way children look when they are deciding whether or not an adult is worth trusting, and they are very serious about the decision. "Can I bring my rabbit?" she asked. Luke stood and held out his hand. "You can bring whatever you want." She looked at his hand. She looked at the wooden rabbit. She looked at the two shapes beyond the wagon that had been her parents. Her face did something complicated and private that Luke did not intrude on. Then she reached out and put her small hand in his. Her fingers were cold despite the heat. He lifted her up and she didn't fight it. She tucked the wooden rabbit under one arm and held onto his shirt with the other hand. And Luke carried her back to Caesar. And Caesar, to his credit, stood perfectly still while Luke got her settled in the saddle. "You ever ridden a horse?" Luke asked. "Once," she said. "Papa let me ride in front of him." "Same thing," Luke said, and swung up behind her. "Hold on to the horn there, that piece in front of you." She gripped it with both hands. The wooden rabbit was tucked between her arm and her ribs. Luke turned Caesar west. They rode in silence for a while, the sun dropping fast behind them now, the sky going deep purple at the edges. Ellie sat straight in the saddle with the concentrated effort of a child trying very hard to be brave. After about a mile, she leaned back slightly, not much, just enough that her back rested against Luke's chest. The way a child leans against something solid when they have finally decided it will hold. Luke did not comment on it. He just held Caesar steady and rode. It was near full dark when they came up the long drive to the ranch. The house was dark. Luke never left lights on anymore, and he could feel the girl tense up slightly as they approached the unlit windows. "It's all right," he said. "Nobody here but us." He got her down from Caesar and led her to the porch while he went back to see to the horse. It took him about 10 minutes. When he came back, she was sitting exactly where he'd left her, on the top porch step, the wooden rabbit in her lap, looking out at the dark. "You didn't run," he said. "Where would I go?" she said. It wasn't a sad question. It was just a fact stated plainly, and it hit Luke somewhere behind the sternum like a thrown stone. He unlocked the door and lit the lamp in the kitchen and got the stove going. He found the dried apples, the mice had not in fact gotten to them, and heated water for something warm. Ellie sat at the kitchen table and watched him work with those careful, measuring eyes. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do." "You got a wife?" Luke kept his back to her. "Had one. She passed." A pause. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." "You got kids?" Another pause, longer this time. "Had a boy. He passed too." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "My mama and papa passed today," she said. "I think, or yesterday. I don't know what day it is anymore." Luke set a mug in front of her. Hot water with dried apple and a little sugar, the best he could do. "It's Thursday," he said. "July 14th. She looked at the mug. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She picked it up with both hands and drank it carefully, the way people drink things when they've forgotten warmth was possible. Luke sat across from her and didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes it was the only honest thing left. After a while she said, "Where am I going to sleep?" Luke thought about the room at the end of the hall. Sarah's sewing room. He'd kept the door closed for 3 years. There was a daybed in there, the one Sarah used when she stayed up late working. He'd never moved it. "Got a room," he said. "Down the hall. Got a bed in it." "Okay," she said. He showed her to it. He found a blanket from the cedar chest in his own room, one of Sarah's quilts, blue and white, the one she'd made the winter she was pregnant with James. He hadn't taken it out in 3 years either. He spread it over the daybed and stood back. Ellie stood in the doorway, looking at the room. "Is this someone's room?" she asked. "It was," he said. "Now it's yours." "Oh." She walked in slowly, like she was being careful not to disturb something. She sat on the edge of the daybed and set the wooden rabbit on the small table beside it. "I don't have any other clothes," she said. "We'll figure that out tomorrow." She nodded. She lay back and pulled the quilt up around her without being told. And Luke was struck by how practiced she was at making do. No complaint, no asking for more, just using what was there. A child who had been taught early that things ran out. He moved to leave. "Mr. Harper," she said. He stopped. "Luke." "It's just Luke." She tried the name out. "Luke, will you still be here in the morning?" He turned back and looked at her. This girl with someone else's quilt pulled up to her chin and her father's wooden rabbit standing guard on the nightstand. "I'll be right down the hall," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. Luke stood in the doorway until her breathing evened out. Then he walked back down the hall, sat in the chair by the kitchen window, and looked out at the dark Montana plain for a long time without moving. He didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in years, it wasn't grief that kept him awake. It was something else, something unfamiliar, an alertness, a sense of someone else in the house that was not a haunting, but actual breathing, and warm and present at the end of the hall. He sat with it until the sky began to lighten. Then he got up and started breakfast. He made enough for 2. The next morning came with the smell of coffee and something frying, and the particular quality of early summer light that turns everything gold. Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her dirty dress, the wooden rabbit in her hand, her hair wild, looking at Luke with an expression that fell somewhere between cautious and starved. "Thought I imagined it," she said. "Nope," Luke said without turning around. "Eggs are almost done. You drink coffee?" "No." "Didn't think so. Got some milk. Sit down." She sat. He set a plate in front of her, and she ate without speaking, methodically, like someone who had learned not to waste time or food. Halfway through, she slowed down and looked at her plate like she'd forgotten she was allowed to stop. "You can eat slower," Luke said. "It's not going anywhere." She looked up. A flicker of something, embarrassment maybe, or just surprise. "Sorry." "Don't apologize. You went 3 days without. Eat however you need to eat." She ate slower. After breakfast, Luke rode into Dry Creek and had the hardest conversation of his week with Sheriff Roy Alderman, a thick-necked, practical man who had known Luke since before the grief set in. "Found him out on the North Trail," Luke said. "Couple days gone, maybe 3. Wagon accident. Looks like no survivors except the girl." "Where's the girl now?" "At my place." Roy studied him. "Luke, she had nowhere else to go." "Roy, she was sitting next to her dead parents for 3 days. She had a canteen empty and she was so thirsty her lips split. What was I supposed to do? Leave her?" Roy was quiet. "I'll file the report," he said finally. "We'll need to identify the bodies, contact whatever family they got. You understand there's a process." "I understand that. You can't just keep her, Luke." "I know that." Luke paused. "I'm just saying nobody's taking her anywhere until we know she's got somewhere safe to go." Roy looked at him a long time. "When'd you get so stubborn?" "I was always stubborn," Luke said. "Just didn't have a reason to show it for a while." He rode back to the ranch. The days that followed had a quietness to them that was different from the silence Luke had lived in before. Before, the quiet was the kind that pressed against the walls. Now it was more like the pause between words, still, but full of something pending. Ellie did not talk much at first. She moved through the house with a careful tentativeness, always staying within sight of Luke, always checking that he was still there. She didn't ask for things. She waited to be offered, and then asked if she could. "Can I go out to the barn?" "Go ahead." "Can I feed the chickens?" "Knock yourself out." "Can I sit out here?" Luke looked up from the fence post he was mending. "Ellie, you don't have to ask permission to exist. This is your home. For now, go where you want. Do what you need. You don't have to check with me first." She stood very still for a moment. "My last home," she said carefully. "I had to ask." Luke set down the post driver. He looked at her. "What happened in your last home?" She didn't answer right away. She looked out at the fence line like she was measuring something. "We had to leave," she said. "Mama said we had to leave fast. Said there was a man who wasn't safe." She paused. "That's why Papa had the wagon. We were going to Oregon." Luke kept his voice level. "This man your mama was scared of, was he family?" Ellie looked at the wooden rabbit in her hand. She turned it over once. "Mama's brother," she said. "Uncle Victor." She said the name the way you say a word you wish didn't exist. Luke noted it. He didn't push. He just picked up the post driver and went back to work. "You can go see the horses," he said. "Caesar likes apples if you got any in your pockets." She went. He watched her cross the yard, this thin, careful, watchful girl, and thought about a man named Victor that a woman had run so far and so fast from that she'd ended up dead in a ditch in Montana. He went back to fixing the fence, but he didn't stop thinking. 3 weeks passed. Ellie learned where the feed buckets were and started filling them without being asked. She discovered that the barn cat, a gray, one-eared tom Luke had never named, would tolerate being held if you sat very still and let him come to you. She started getting up before Luke some mornings and putting the coffee on, though it came out thin and slightly burnt, and Luke drank every cup without complaint. She began to talk more, not much at first, small observations. The way the barn cat walked, which horses she liked best, what she'd dreamed about the night before, delivered in the morning with a kind of matter-of-fact shortness, like she was reporting news. "Dreamed about my mama last night," she said one morning, not sad, just factual. "What was she doing?" Luke asked. "Sewing," Ellie said. "She was always sewing something." "What was she sewing?" Ellie thought about it. "A quilt," she said. "Blue and white." Luke looked up from his coffee. Ellie didn't notice. She was already looking out the window. "I'm going to go check on the cat," she said, and slid off her chair. Luke sat alone in the kitchen a moment, looking at his cup. Then he got up and went out to do the morning chores. 4 weeks in, Sheriff Roy Alderman rode up the drive on a Tuesday afternoon. Luke saw him coming and went out to meet him on the porch. Ellie was in the barn. Luke intended to keep it that way. "Found some next of kin," Roy said, dismounting. Luke said nothing. "Man named Victor Hale," Roy said, "Chicago. Says he's the girl's mother's brother, biological family." Roy looked at Luke. "He's already got a lawyer working on it, Luke." "What kind of man hires a lawyer before he's even met the child?" Luke said. "The kind that wants something," Roy said. They looked at each other. "He coming out here?" Luke asked. "Already on a train," Roy said. "Be in Dry Creek by end of the week." Luke turned and looked at the barn, where Ellie was somewhere inside with the cat and the horses in the afternoon light. "She's scared of him, Roy. She told me her mama was running from this man." "That may be," Roy said. "But scared or not, the law's the law. Blood is blood." Luke's hands tightened on the porch rail. "Not always." Roy Alderman put his hat back on and looked at him a long moment with something that might have been sympathy and might have been warning, and was probably both. "You got no legal claim on that girl, Luke," he said quietly. "Not yet," Luke said. Roy rode away without answering that. Luke stood on the porch until he was gone. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, where a small girl with a wooden rabbit was talking to a one-eared cat in the golden light of a July afternoon, not knowing that a man from Chicago was already on a train headed her way. Luke stopped in the barn doorway. Ellie looked up. She had the barn cat in her lap and a piece of straw in her hand, teasing him with it while he batted lazily at the air. "You okay?" she said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "You want to help me fix the south gate before supper? That latch has been sticking all week." "Okay," she said, and set the cat down and stood up and brushed the hay off her skirt. She walked past him out of the barn, already heading toward the south pasture, and Luke watched her go. This girl who had been abandoned to die beside a broken wagon, who had been running from something terrible, who had sat in his kitchen and eaten his eggs and named his barn cat One Ear and put the coffee on every morning. He felt something settle in his chest with the weight and certainty of a stone laid into a wall. Whatever was coming, he would handle it. He had made a promise. He did not break promises. He pulled the barn door shut behind him and followed her south across the field. Victor Hale arrived on a Friday. Luke knew because Roy Alderman sent word the night before. And Luke spent Thursday evening doing the only thing he knew how to do when his mind wouldn't quiet. He worked. Fixed the barn latch that had been sticking. Rehung the kitchen door that had started dragging. Replaced 3 boards on the porch steps that had gone soft. He worked until his hands ached and the lamp oil was running low, and even then he sat in the dark kitchen for an hour before finally going to bed. He did not sleep. Ellie came into the kitchen at 6 in the morning and stopped when she saw him already sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept fine." She sat down across from him and put the wooden rabbit on the table between them. She'd started doing that lately, setting it on the table like a centerpiece, like it was the head of the household. "You're lying," she said. "I'm a grown man. I don't have to explain my sleep to a 7-year-old. "I'm 8, she said. "You told me 7 last week. I changed my mind." She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "Something's happening. I can tell." Luke set his cup down. He looked at the wooden rabbit, then at Ellie. She deserved the truth. He'd decided that already, lying awake in the dark. She was a child who had survived 3 days alone next to her dead parents by being sharper and tougher than the world expected her to be. Lying to her would be an insult. "A man is coming to town today," he said. "Says he's your family." The color left her face so fast it was like watching a candle go out. "Victor," she said, not a question. "That's what they're saying." She didn't move for a moment. Then she picked up the wooden rabbit and held it in her lap under the table, where Luke couldn't see it. He understood that was where it went when she was scared. "He can't take me," she said. Her voice was flat and certain, the way children are certain about things when they've already thought them through at length. "I won't go." "Nobody's taken you anywhere today," Luke said. "He'll use lawyers," she said. "He'll try." She looked at him. "He always used lawyers. Mama said that was how he fought, with paper and words, not his hands. She said that was almost worse." Luke studied her. "What do you mean, almost?" Ellie's jaw tightened. "He used his hands, too, just not where you could see it." The kitchen went very quiet. Luke pushed back from the table. He stood. He went to the window and looked out at the morning for a moment with his back to her, because he needed a second before he could keep his voice even. "He hurt your mama?" It wasn't a question either. "Yes." "Did he ever hurt you?" A pause that lasted too long. "He was going to," she said. "That's why we left." Luke turned back around. He looked at this small girl sitting at his kitchen table, holding her dead father's carved rabbit in her lap under the table where he couldn't see how hard she was gripping it. "Ellie," he said, "look at me." She looked up. "Nobody has taken you anywhere," he said. "Not today. Not while I'm standing." She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her face, not relief exactly, more like the cautious recognition of a possibility she hadn't fully let herself believe yet. "People say things," she said. "I know they do," Luke said. "I also know I'm still here every morning when you come into this kitchen. Have I missed one yet?" She thought about it. "No." "All right then." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The silence between them was full of a promise that neither of them had spoken aloud, but both of them understood completely. And in that kitchen, with the morning light slanting through the window and the dust motes floating in the air, Luke Harper looked at this girl and knew that whatever Victor Hale brought with him from Chicago, it would not be enough to take her away. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. The morning after Victor Hale's arrival came in gray, the sun struggling through a haze that pressed down on the prairie like a held breath. Luke was up before first light, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the road that led to Dry Creek. He had not slept more than an hour. Every creak of the house, every shift of wind against the wall, pulled him back to alertness. He kept seeing Ellie's face when she said the name Victor, the way the color had drained, the way her hands had gone to the wooden rabbit like it was armor. He heard her footsteps before she appeared. She came into the kitchen, already dressed, her hair pulled back with a piece of twine she'd found somewhere, her eyes clear and watchful. She looked at him, then at the cold coffee in his hand, then back at his face. "You didn't sleep again," she said. "I slept enough." She didn't argue. She walked to the stove, lifted the coffee pot, felt it was cold, and set about making a fresh one without being asked. Luke watched her move through the kitchen with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to take care of herself long before she should have had to. She measured the grounds by eye, poured the water steady, set the pot on the stove with the same deliberate care she used for everything. When she was done, she turned and faced him. "When is he coming?" she asked. "Roy said this afternoon." She nodded. She pulled out her chair and sat at the table, folding her hands in front of her. The wooden rabbit was not in her hands. Luke noticed she had left it in her room, and he understood that meant she had already decided how she was going to face this. She was not going to let Victor see her holding something that mattered. "You don't have to talk to him," Luke said. "You don't have to go near him if you don't want to." "He'll make me," she said quietly. "Not on my property, he won't." She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes that was older than her years. Not bitterness, not fear, a kind of tired knowing. "He'll be nice at first," she said. "He's always nice when people are watching. That's how he gets what he wants." Luke sat down across from her. "What does he want, Ellie?" She was quiet for a long moment. The coffee began to perk on the stove, the only sound in the room. "Everything," she said finally. "That's what Mama said. He wants everything. And he don't care who he has to go through to get it." Luke held her gaze. "Then he's going to have to go through me." Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief, more like the smallest crack in a wall that had been built brick by brick over years. She looked down at her hands. "He's got money," she said. "He's got lawyers. He's got people who do things for him. And I've got a fence that needs mending and a barn cat that don't like strangers," Luke said. "We'll see who holds up better." A sound escaped her. It was not quite a laugh, more like the ghost of one, the memory of something she had not done in a long time. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window. Victor Hale arrived at 2 o'clock in a hired buggy, the same lawyer, Crane, sitting beside him. This time, Roy Alderman was already there, having ridden out an hour earlier to wait on the porch. Luke had not asked him to. Roy had simply shown up, said, "Figured you'd want a witness," and taken a seat on the top step with the patient stillness of a man who had learned to wait. The buggy pulled to a stop in the yard. Hale stepped down first, smoothing his coat, looking around the ranch with the same appraising expression Luke had seen before, the look of a man calculating value, not greeting family. Crane followed, a leather satchel under his arm, his glasses catching the afternoon light. "Mr. Harper," Hale said, his voice warm and practiced. "Sheriff." Thank you for allowing this visit." Luke did not return the greeting. He stood on the porch with his arms folded and his weight set. "She's inside. She'll come out when she's ready." Hale's smile did not falter. "Of course. I don't want to rush her. This must be very difficult for her." "It is." Roy stood and moved to the side, positioning himself where he could see both the yard and the door. He did not speak, but his presence was a weight in the air. They waited. The sun moved a hand's width across the sky. The barn cat appeared on the fence post, sat down, and stared at the buggy with undisguised hostility. Nobody, the spotted dog, lay on the porch with his head on his paws, watching the strangers with the loose alertness of an animal ready to move if needed. Then the screen door opened, and Ellie stepped out. She had changed her dress. Luke noticed that first, the one Mrs. Calloway from the dry goods store had given her, a simple blue calico that fit her better than the torn one she'd arrived in. Her hair was brushed and tied back with a ribbon Miss Arden had brought from the schoolhouse. She looked clean and cared for, and she looked like a child who had dressed herself for battle. She stopped on the porch beside Luke. She did not touch him, but she stood close enough that her shoulder was a breath from his arm. She faced Victor Hale with her chin level and her hands at her sides. "Ellie," Hale said, and his voice dropped into a softer register. "Sweetheart, look how you've grown." She said nothing. Hale took a step forward. "I've been so worried about you. When I heard about your mama and papa, I came as fast as I could." "You took a month," Ellie said. The smile flickered, just barely. "There were arrangements, sweetheart. Legal matters. Finding out where you were. I was here the whole time," she said. "Mr. Harper sent a telegram to the sheriff 2 days after he found me. You could have come then." Crane shifted his weight. Roy's eyes moved to Hale's face, watching. Hale's smile held, but something behind it had gone still. "I came as soon as I could arrange proper travel. You have to understand, Ellie, there's a lot involved in settling an estate. Your parents left things in some disarray." "They left because of you," Ellie said. The words landed in the yard like stones. Nobody lifted his head. The barn cat stopped washing his paw. Even the horses in the pasture seemed to still. Hale's face did not change, but his voice, when he spoke, had lost its warmth. "That's a very serious thing to say, Ellie. I don't think you understand what you're talking about." "I understand plenty," she said. "I was there." Luke put his hand on her shoulder. Not heavy, just there. A reminder that she was not standing alone. Roy stepped forward. "I think that's enough for today," he said. "Mr. Hale, you've had your visit. The child's made her position clear." Hale looked at Roy, then at Luke, then at Ellie. His expression had settled into something smooth and cold, like a pond freezing over. "This isn't over," he said. "She's a minor. She's my blood. The law will see that." "The law will see what the evidence shows," Roy said. "And so far, the evidence shows a healthy child being cared for by a fit guardian." "Temporary guardian," Crane said, speaking for the first time. His voice was thin and precise, like a blade. "Without legal standing. That will be addressed at the hearing." "Then we'll address it," Luke said. He had not moved from the porch. He did not raise his voice. "You've had your visit. The road's that way." Hale stood a moment longer, looking at Ellie with an expression that Luke could not read and did not want to. Then he turned, walked to the buggy, and climbed in without another word. Crane followed. The buggy turned in the yard and rolled back down the drive, dust rising behind it. Roy let out a long breath. "Well, that went about how I expected." Luke looked down at Ellie. She had not moved. Her hands were still at her sides, but they were clenched into fists now, white at the knuckles. "You did good," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. "He's not going to stop." "I know." "He's going to try to take me." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are we going to do?" Luke looked at the dust settling on the road, and he thought about the way Hale had looked at the ranch, that appraising, measuring look. He thought about what Ellie had said about her father's papers, about the lawyer in Miles City. He thought about a man named Daniel Carter, who had measured land for a living, and who had, according to his daughter, put something away where Victor could not reach it. "We're going to figure out what your father left behind," he said, "and we're going to make sure Victor Hale never gets his hands on it." That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, Luke sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote down everything she had told him about her father's trip to Miles City. He wrote down the name Alderman. He wrote down the word papers and oil rights and contracts. He wrote down the date of Ellie's birthday, August 3rd, and the fact that she had just turned 8. He stared at the paper for a long time, turning over what he knew and what he did not know. He was not a man given to schemes or strategies. He was a rancher. He understood fences and weather and horses. He understood the weight of a promise and the cost of breaking one. But he did not understand the law, and he knew that Victor Hale understood it very well. That was the gap he had to close. He went to bed after midnight and lay awake, listening to the wind move through the eaves, thinking about a man he had never met who had carved a wooden rabbit for his daughter and hidden a future she might never know she had. In the morning he made his decision. "I need to go to Miles City," he said at breakfast. Ellie looked up from her plate. "Your father left something with a lawyer there, a man named Thomas Alderman, Roy's brother. If it's what I think it is, it could make a difference at the hearing. How long will you be gone?" 2 days, maybe 3. I'll push Caesar hard." Ellie set her fork down. She looked at him with those steady, measuring eyes. "What if Victor comes while you're gone?" Luke had already thought of that. "Roy'll be watching, and I'm going to ask Miss Arden if you can stay at the schoolhouse while I'm away. You'll be safe there." "I don't want to stay at the schoolhouse." "I know, but I need you somewhere I know you're safe." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You'll come back?" The question hit him harder than he expected. It was not an accusation. It was the honest fear of a child who had been left too many times, by too many people, in too many ways. "I'll come back," he said. "I told you before, I don't make promises I don't keep." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once and picked up her fork. He left before noon. He rode Caesar hard, the way he had when he was a younger man with somewhere to be and no time to waste. The miles unrolled behind him, flat and brown and endless, the sun moving across the sky in a slow arc that told him nothing he did not already know. He stopped only to rest the horse and to drink from his canteen. He ate a piece of jerky while riding, chewing mechanically, his mind already miles ahead. The second day, the terrain began to change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, and then to the outskirts of Miles City, a town larger than Dry Creek, with real streets and a bank and a hotel that had 3 stories. Luke had been here before, years ago, for cattle sales. He remembered the layout well enough to find the address Roy had given him. Thomas Alderman's office was above a hardware store on Main Street. Narrow staircase, worn wooden treads. A brass plate on the door read, "Alderman and Associates, Legal Services." Luke knocked. The man who opened the door was thinner than Roy, older-looking with wire-rimmed glasses and the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent his life among documents. He looked at Luke with the cautious curiosity of a man who had learned not to trust strangers. "Help you? You Thomas Alderman?" "I am. I'm Luke Harper. I'm the one who found your brother's wagon wreck, the Carter family." Thomas Alderman's expression changed. The caution loosened. Something like recognition moved behind his eyes. "Daniel Carter's girl. She alive?" "She's alive. She's at my ranch. She's doing well." Thomas stepped back and held the door open. "Come in." The office was small, cluttered with books and papers, a heavy desk that took up most of the room. Thomas cleared a chair and gestured for Luke to sit. He did not offer coffee. He sat down behind the desk and folded his hands. "Roy sent me a telegram about the case," Thomas said. "He said you'd likely be coming. He said to trust you. He's a good man. He's my brother. That don't always mean the same thing, but in this case, I believe it." Thomas leaned back. "Daniel Carter came to me 2 years ago. Said he needed to put something away where no one could get at it. Said there was a man, his wife's brother, who was after his land and his contracts. Said the man had already tried once to take it through legal means and once through other means. He did not specify what those other means were, but I got the impression they were not pleasant." Luke listened without interrupting. Daniel had documents, land deeds, oil exploration contracts, a transfer of ownership that would take effect on his daughter's 8th birthday. He wanted them held in trust, with a single condition, that they only be released to someone who knew the word. The word? The word he gave his daughter. He told me she would remember it. He said it was the only key. Luke sat forward. She knows it. Thomas studied him. She told you? She didn't have to. She carries it with her everywhere. A wooden rabbit. Something moved in Thomas's face. Not surprise, recognition. That's the word then, rabbit. He shook his head slowly. He carved that rabbit himself. I saw it once, when he came to the office. He said it was for his little girl. I didn't realize it was also a key. Can you give me the documents? I can give them to her, in person. That was Daniel's instruction. The documents go to the girl, with the word, or to the person she designates. Thomas paused. You planning to bring her here? Hearing's in 9 days. I don't know if I can get her here and back in time, and I don't want to leave her alone any longer than I have to. Thomas nodded slowly. Then I'll come to you. I've got a horse. I can ride to Dry Creek in 3 days, maybe a little less. I'll bring the documents. We'll need to have a formal identification of the word, but that can be done in front of a witness, your sheriff brother, perhaps. Luke felt something loosen in his chest. A thread of hope, thin but present. You'd do that? Daniel Carter was a good man. He trusted me with his family's future. I don't take that lightly. Thomas stood and extended his hand. I'll be there in 4 days. Tell Ellie to keep that rabbit close. Luke shook his hand. She never lets it go. He rode back the same way he had come, but the ride felt different now. The weight had not lifted. Victor Hale was still out there, and the hearing was still coming. But there was now a shape to the path ahead, where before there had only been a wall. He had a plan. He had a thread to pull. He reached the ranch late on the 3rd day, exhausted and stiff, but with the satisfaction of a man who had done what he set out to do. Ellie was on the porch when he rode up, and she was on her feet and running before he could dismount. You came back, she said, and she was not quite crying, but her voice was tight with something she was holding in. I told you I would. She stopped a few feet from him and looked up, her eyes searching his face for whatever news he carried. Did you find him? I found him. He's coming here. He's bringing your father's papers. She went very still. Everything? Everything. Your father set it up so that you're the only one who can claim them, and you already know the word. She looked down at her empty hands. She had left the rabbit inside, he realized, probably because she had been on the porch watching for him and had not wanted to risk dropping it in the dirt. But she touched her chest, where the shape of it usually rested, and said quietly, Rabbit. That's the one. She looked back up at him, and this time there was something new in her eyes. Not hope exactly. Ellie was not a child given to easy hope, but something that looked like the beginning of it, the first crack of light under a door that had been sealed for a long time. He planned it, she said. Papa planned it. He knew. He knew, Luke said, and he made sure you'd be taken care of, even if he wasn't there. She stood in the yard for a moment, letting that settle. The sun was going down behind her, casting her shadow long across the grass. Nobody came up and pressed his nose against her hand, and she absently scratched his ears. Can I go get my rabbit now? She asked. Go ahead. She turned and ran into the house. Luke watched her go, and then he stood in the yard with his hand on Caesar's neck, letting the exhaustion wash over him. He had ridden nearly 100 miles in 3 days. He had found the thread, and now he had to pray it was strong enough to hold. The next 2 days were a quiet wait. Ellie went to school in the mornings and came home in the afternoons, and Luke worked the ranch with a kind of determined focus that kept his mind from wandering down roads he did not want to travel. He fixed the south gate properly, the way he had been meaning to for months. He mucked out the barn. He checked every fence post on the northern line and replaced 2 that had started to rot. He worked until his body was too tired to think, and then he sat on the porch in the evenings with Ellie beside him, and they watched the stars come out, and they did not talk about what was coming. Thomas Alderman arrived on the 4th day, just as he had promised. He came riding up the drive on a sturdy bay mare, a leather satchel strapped across his back. He looked tired but steady. He dismounted in the yard, shook Luke's hand, and looked at the house. She inside? She's inside. They went in together. Ellie was at the kitchen table, the wooden rabbit in front of her, both hands resting on it. She looked up when they entered, and she did not look away. Thomas sat down across from her. He opened the satchel and pulled out a stack of papers, bound with a ribbon. He set them on the table, on the other side of the rabbit. "Ellie," he said, "your father gave me these 2 years ago. He said I was to hold them until you were 8 years old, or until someone came for them who could give me the word. Do you know what word that is?" She looked at the rabbit, then she looked at Thomas. "Rabbit," she said. Thomas nodded. He untied the ribbon and spread the papers on the table. "Then these are yours." Luke watched as Ellie looked at the documents. She did not touch them at first. She just looked, her eyes moving over the lines of text she could not fully read, but understood the weight of. "What do they say?" she asked. Thomas pointed to each one as he explained. The land deed for the Wyoming property, the oil exploration contracts, the transfer of ownership that made her the sole legal holder of everything her father had owned. He explained it in simple terms, the way a man explains something to a child who needs to understand because her life depends on it. When he was done, Ellie sat back in her chair. She picked up the wooden rabbit and held it against her chest. "Papa did this," she said. "He did." She looked at Luke. "He made sure I had something. He made sure you had everything," Luke said. "And now Victor can't touch it." She looked down at the papers again. Then, very carefully, she reached out and touched the corner of the deed, as if to confirm that it was real. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Thomas said, "we take these to the hearing, and we show the judge that Victor Hale has no claim on you or on anything your father left behind." The hearing was 6 days away. Luke spent those 6 days doing what he could to prepare, but the truth was that the documents did most of the work for him. Thomas stayed at the ranch, sleeping in the spare room that had once been Sarah's sewing room, reviewing the papers and preparing his arguments. Ellie went to school and came home and fed the chickens and talked to the barn cat and sat on the swing Luke had built for her, moving back and forth in the afternoon light with the wooden rabbit in her lap. And Victor Hale, from all reports, stayed in Dry Creek, meeting with his lawyer, writing letters, making plans. The night before the hearing, Luke could not sleep. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. The documents were solid. The law was on their side. But Victor Hale had resources that Luke could not match. He had a lawyer who had been in the courtroom before. He had the weight of blood, the presumption of family. And Luke had a child who had chosen him. He was still sitting there when the door opened and Ellie came out. She was in her nightgown, the wooden rabbit in her hand, her hair tangled from sleep. She did not say anything. She just sat down beside him on the porch, pulled her knees up to her chest, and leaned against his arm. They sat that way for a long time. The wind moved through the grass. An owl called from the direction of the barn. The night held them, quiet and patient, waiting for the morning. "Luke," she said finally. "Yeah. Tomorrow, when the judge asks me, I'm going to tell him I want to stay with you. I know you are. And you're going to be there. I'll be right there." She was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, she said, "Okay." She did not say anything else. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and after a while her breathing evened out, and she slept. Luke did not move. He sat on the porch with his daughter asleep against his arm, and he watched the stars fade one by one as the sky began to lighten in the east. Morning came clear and cold for August. Luke built a fire in the stove, made breakfast, and woke Ellie when the coffee was ready. She ate without speaking, her face set in the same careful determination she had worn every day since he found her. Thomas came down with his satchel. Roy arrived before they finished eating, riding up with a nod that told Luke everything he needed to know. The sheriff was ready. The town was ready, and Victor Hale was about to find out that blood was not always thicker than the promise a man made to a child in a broken wagon. They rode into Dry Creek together, Luke and Ellie in the wagon, Thomas and Roy on horseback behind. The streets were quiet, but there were people standing on the boardwalks, watching them pass. Miss Arden was at the door of the schoolhouse, her hands folded. Mrs. Calloway stood in front of her dry goods store, wiping her hands on her apron. Doc Harove was on the steps of his office, his hat in his hands. They were not there to watch the spectacle, they were there to witness. Luke pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the courthouse. He helped Ellie down. She was wearing the blue calico dress and a pair of boots Mrs. Calloway had given her, and she held the wooden rabbit in one hand and Luke's hand in the other. "Ready?" he asked. She looked up at him. Her eyes were clear. Her chin was steady. "Ready," she said. They walked up the steps together, through the doors, and into the room where the future would be decided. The courthouse in Dry Creek was a single large room with a high ceiling and windows that let in the morning light in long, dusty shafts. The benches were filled, more people than Luke had ever seen in this building, standing along the walls and spilling out the doors. He recognized faces from town and from the outlying ranches, men he had traded fence posts with, women he had nodded to at the general store, children from Ellie's school who had begged their parents to come. Roy guided them to the front. Luke sat at the respondents' table with Ellie beside him. Thomas Alderman sat on his other side, the leather satchel open on the table, the documents arranged in order. Across the aisle, Victor Hale sat with Crane. Hale looked composed, immaculate, his pale eyes fixed forward. He did not look at Ellie. Judge Whitmore entered, and the room rose and settled again in a rustle of fabric and creaking wood. He was a heavy man with a gray beard and the kind of face that had seen too many people lie to him to be easily impressed. He looked over the room, noted the crowd, and said nothing about it. "Mr. Crane," he said, "you may proceed." Crane stood, adjusted his glasses, and began. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, his voice smooth and reasonable, laying out the case for Victor Hale's claim. The man was the closest living blood relative. He had means, a home in Chicago, the ability to provide education and stability. He had been prevented from accessing the child by an unrelated third party who had no legal standing. The language was careful, precise, and entirely devoid of warmth. Luke listened without moving. He had learned long ago that when a man talks too much, he is trying to cover something. Crane talked a great deal. When Crane finished, Whitmore turned to Thomas. "Mr. Alderman." Thomas rose. He was not a dramatic man. He spoke plainly, the way a man speaks when he knows the facts are on his side. He introduced the documents one by one, explaining their significance in simple terms. The land deeds, the oil contracts, the transfer of ownership that had taken effect on Ellie's 8th birthday. He produced the letter from Daniel Carter, sealed and dated, and read the relevant passages aloud. When he finished, he said, "Your Honor, Victor Hale's claim to this child has nothing to do with family. It has to do with property. The child's father, Daniel Carter, anticipated this and took steps to protect his daughter from a man he had reason to fear. The documentation is clear, legal, and predates any action by the petitioner." Crane was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the validity of those documents is entirely unproven. The timing is convenient. The circumstances of Mr. Carter's death make any document signed in the months prior suspect. We request time to verify the authenticity." "You've had time," Whitmore said. "You've been in this county for nearly 2 weeks. Did you not investigate?" Crane's jaw tightened. "We were not provided access to these documents until yesterday." "That's because you had no claim to them," Thomas said. "They belong to the child. You are not entitled to her property." Whitmore held up a hand. "Enough." He looked at the documents, flipped through them slowly, reading each page. The room was completely silent. A fly buzzed against one of the windows. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped. The judge set the papers down and looked at Ellie. "Miss Carter," he said, "will you come up here, please?" Ellie stood. She walked to the front of the room, the wooden rabbit in her hand, and stood before the judge's desk. She did not look at Victor Hale. She kept her eyes on Whitmore. "I'm not going to ask you complicated questions," he said. "I just want to know one thing. Where do you want to go home to when this is over?" Ellie turned and looked at the room. She looked at the faces, Miss Arden, Doc Harrove, Mrs. Calloway, the children from school, the ranchers she had come to know by name. She looked at Victor Hale, his face still and composed. Then she looked at Luke Harper, sitting at the table with his hat in his hands and his eyes on her. She walked across the room. Her footsteps were the only sound. She stopped in front of Luke, and she put her hand in his the same way she had on the day he found her, carefully, deliberately, fully chosen. "He's my father," she said. Her voice filled the room. "Not because we were born that way, Because he decided to be. And I decided to let him. She paused. That's the same as blood. Maybe it's more. The room held its breath. Victor Hale's chair scraped back. He stood, his face tight, and looked at Crane. Crane was already gathering his papers, his expression unreadable. Whitmore picked up his pen. I am granting full legal guardianship of the minor child Eleanor Carter to Lucas Harper. The petitioner's claim is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Hale, I strongly advise you to retain counsel for the separate matters now likely coming your way. This court is done with you. He tapped the gavel once. The room erupted. People were standing, talking, some laughing, some crying. Miss Arden was openly weeping. Doc Harrove was pumping Thomas's hand. Roy was pushing through the crowd toward them, and his face had done something it almost never did. It had let go of its professional composure and was just grinning like a boy. But Luke barely heard any of it. He was looking at Ellie, who was still holding his hand, her fingers cold and small and steady in his. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She did not smile. She did not cry. She just stood there, holding his hand, her face quiet and still, like someone who had finally reached the end of a very long road and was not yet sure how to stop walking. They left the courthouse together. The boardwalk was full of people, and many of them called out, reached out, wanted to touch Ellie's shoulder or shake Luke's hand. He moved through them carefully, keeping Ellie close, until they reached the wagon. He lifted her onto the seat and climbed up beside her. The ride home was quiet. The sun was high and warm, the grass moving in a slow wind. Nobody rode beside them, his tongue hanging out, apparently as relieved as anyone. Ellie sat with the wooden rabbit in her lap, looking out at the prairie, not speaking. About a mile from the ranch, she said, "I want to read the letter." Luke looked at her. "Papa's letter, the one Thomas brought. I want to read it when we get home." "It's yours," Luke said. "You can read it whenever you want." She nodded and went back to looking at the horizon. The ranch looked different when they pulled up the drive. It was the same in every physical way. Same fence line, same barn, same porch with the third step that still creaked. But it looked different, the way a place looks when you have been away from it under uncertain circumstances and come back with certainty. Like it had decided to be home while they were gone and was just waiting for them to notice. Ellie jumped down from the wagon before it fully stopped and went straight to the barn, because One Ear had appeared on the fence post, and she considered his feelings about being ignored a personal responsibility. Luke unhitched the horses, saw to Caesar, filled the water troughs, moved through the familiar motions of evening chores with a steadiness in his hands that had not been there that morning. Guardianship, full and legal, dismissed with prejudice. The words settled into him slowly, the way water soaks into dry ground. He went inside and started dinner. Ellie came in 40 minutes later with hay in her hair and One Ear following 3 steps behind her with the proprietary air of a cat who had decided to relocate indoors permanently. She sat at the table and watched Luke cook and gave him a running report of everything One Ear had done since they had been gone, which was apparently considerable. And Luke listened to all of it and said the right things at the right moments, and felt something in his chest that he recognized after a while as the particular warmth of ordinary life. Not dramatic, not earned through crisis, just present and unremarkable, and exactly right. After dinner, Ellie went to her room and came back with the letter. Thomas had given it to her at the courthouse, still sealed in the original wax, her name written on the outside in her father's careful hand. She set it on the table between them and looked at it for a moment without touching it. "Will you stay while I read it?" she asked. "Right here," Luke said. She broke the seal. She read slowly. Luke watched her face, not the letter, and saw the small movements that crossed it, the tightening around her eyes at something in the first paragraph, the slight tremor at her chin that she controlled immediately. Her breath caught once, and she stopped and started again. She read the whole thing without speaking. When she finished, she set it flat on the table and put both hands on it and sat with her eyes closed for a moment. "He knew," she said. "He'd already sent copies of everything to the Federal Land Office before we left. He said in the letter that no matter what happened to him, Victor would never be able to touch it because the federal record superseded any local challenge." She opened her eyes. He sealed it all up months before the accident. He just never told Mama because he didn't want her to know how scared he was. Luke sat with that. He protected you from the beginning. He protected me after he was gone, she said. That's different. She looked at the letter. He wrote that if I was reading this letter, it meant he wasn't there to give it to me in person, and he was sorry about that. But he needed me to understand that being sorry about something you couldn't control was a waste of the life you still had left. Her voice broke on the last 4 words, just slightly. Then it steadied. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Luke said. He was the best person I knew, she said, until you. The kitchen was very quiet. Luke looked at this girl, his daughter, the papers said, and the gavel, and the sound of her footsteps crossing that room. And he did not trust himself to say anything for a moment. That's a lot to live up to, he said finally. You're already doing it, she said. You just haven't noticed. She folded the letter carefully and took it back to her room. Luke sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night around him, the creak of the house adjusting to the cooling air, the soft rustle of nobody settling on the porch, the distant low of a horse in the pasture. He thought about Daniel Carter, a man he had never met, who had carved a wooden rabbit and written a letter and buried his future in a lawyer's office, hoping that someone would find his daughter before it was too late. Someone had. And now she was asleep in the room at the end of the hall, under a quilt her mother had sewn, with a wooden rabbit on the nightstand and a father's letter folded under her pillow. Luke sat in the dark and let himself feel the weight of that. It was heavy. But it was not crushing. It was the weight of something real, something he had chosen, something that was now his to carry. He went to bed after midnight and slept deeper than he had in years. The weeks that followed were quiet in the best way. Ellie went to school every morning, walking down the drive to meet Miss Arden's wagon, and came home every afternoon with stories about arithmetic and spelling and the new books Mrs. Calloway had donated. She helped Luke with the evening chores without being asked. She named the barn cat officially, Jed, after a character in a book Miss Arden had read aloud. And Jed accepted the name with the grudging tolerance of a cat who had been called worse. And she swung. The swing Luke had built under the oak tree became her place. She sat there in the afternoons after school, moving back and forth in the golden light, the wooden rabbit in her lap, her eyes on the horizon. Sometimes she talked to herself, or to the rabbit, or to nobody in particular. Luke never asked what she said. He figured if she wanted him to know, she would tell him. One Saturday, near the end of September, the first cool air of autumn moved across the prairie. Luke was mending a section of fence near the east pasture when Ellie came walking out with a canteen and a piece of bread. "You've been out here since breakfast," she said, handing him the canteen. "Fence don't fix itself." She sat down on a nearby rock and watched him work. He could feel her watching, not impatiently, just the way she watched everything, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that details mattered. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the oil contracts." Luke stopped and looked at her. "What about them?" "I want to use some of it for Miss Arden's school, for new books. Real ones, not just the ones people donate because they're too worn to keep." She paused. "And I want to find the families in Illinois, the ones Victor hurt. I want to see if any of them need help." Luke set down the post driver and walked over to her. He sat on the ground beside her rock, taking the bread she offered, breaking off a piece. "That's a fine idea," he said. "You think so? I think your father would be proud of you." She looked down at the wooden rabbit in her hands. "I still miss him," she said quietly. "Every day. I miss Mama too, but it's different now. It don't hurt the same way." "That's not a bad thing," Luke said. "That's just time doing what time does." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "Is that what happened with your wife? And your boy?" Luke took a breath. The question did not catch him off guard. He had known it would come eventually. Ellie was too observant, too direct, to let that part of his life remain a closed door forever. "It got easier," he said. "Not because I stopped missing them. I never stopped. But the missing became part of me, like a scar. It's still there, but it don't hurt every minute the way it did at first." She nodded slowly. "I think I understand that." They sat together in the afternoon light, the fence half mended, the bread half eaten, The canteen passed back and forth between them. Nobody came wandering up and lay down in the grass at Ellie's feet, his head on his paws, his eyes half closed in the sun. "Can I tell you something?" Ellie said. "Always. I'm glad it was you who found me." Luke looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the wooden rabbit, turning it over in her hands the way she did when she was thinking something through. "Not just because you took me in," she continued, "but because you didn't make it strange. You just let me be there. You didn't ask me to be grateful or to pretend I wasn't sad. You just let me be." Luke did not know what to say to that. He had not thought of it as a choice. He had simply done what seemed necessary, fed her, sheltered her, given her space to heal. He had not considered that the absence of demand might be its own kind of gift. "You didn't need to be grateful," he said finally. "You were a child who needed help. That's all I saw." She nodded, still not looking at him. "I know. That's why it mattered." She stood and brushed off her skirt. "I'm going to go check on Jed," she said, and walked back toward the barn. Luke watched her go, then picked up the post driver and went back to the fence. The afternoon light was long and gold, and the work was steady in his hands. And he thought about what she had said. "You just let me be." It was not a complicated thing, but maybe the most important things never were. October came in with a hard frost that turned the grass white and brittle. Luke spent a week hauling hay from the north field, storing it in the barn for the winter. Ellie helped, stacking the bales in the loft, her breath puffing in the cold air, her cheeks red from the wind. One evening they sat on the porch after supper, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars appear one by one. The sky was clear and sharp, the air so cold it hurt to breathe deep. Nobody was curled at their feet, his nose tucked under his tail. Jed had refused to come out, preferring the warmth of the kitchen stove. "Luke," Ellie said. "Yeah. Can I ask you something?" "You never have to ask to ask." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her words. "Do you think people can find family twice in one life?" He looked at her sideways. She was watching the stars, her face serious, the wooden rabbit in her lap under the blanket. "I think some people spend their whole lives with the family they were born into, and that's enough for them," he said. "And I think other people get handed something different, a harder road, and a different kind of arrival." He paused. "I don't think one is more real than the other. I think chosen is just as true as blood. Sometimes it's truer." She turned the wooden rabbit over in her hands. "Papa always said the best things in life were the ones you worked for, not the ones that just happened to you." Smart man. He would have liked you. Luke did not answer. He did not need to. The silence between them was full and warm, even in the cold. "He would have liked you," she said again, and leaned against his shoulder. They sat that way until the stars had wheeled overhead and the cold had seeped through the blankets, and Luke finally said, "Time for bed." She did not argue. She stood, still holding the rabbit, and walked to the door. Before she went inside, she turned back. "Luke?" "Yeah." "Thank you for not riding past the wagon." He looked at her in the dim light from the kitchen window, this small girl with her father's carved rabbit and her mother's quilt, and the whole future waiting for her in the morning. "Thank you for asking me to stay," he said. She smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. "Good night, Luke." "Good night, Ellie." She went inside. Luke stayed on the porch a while longer, watching the stars, thinking about a broken wagon and a July road and a child who had asked him not to leave. He had not left, he had stayed. And staying had turned out to be the best thing he had ever done. The door opened again. Ellie's head poked out. "I forgot to tell you something." "What's that?" "Jed caught a mouse today, a big one. He left it on the porch step." "Did he now?" "He was very proud. He meowed at it for a while before he ate it." Luke smiled. "That's good, a working cat." "He's the best," she said, and disappeared back inside. Luke sat in the dark, still smiling, and thought about the mouse and the cat and the girl and the strange grace that had brought them all together. A broken wagon, a hot July day. A man who had almost ridden past. He had almost ridden past. He thought about that. How close he had come to missing her, to riding on, to leaving her there with her dead parents and her empty canteen and her wooden rabbit. He had almost done it. He had smelled the smoke and almost turned back. He had seen the wagon and almost assumed there were no survivors. He had almost made the choice that would have left her alone for another night, another day, until there was no one left to find her. But he had not. He had followed the smell. He had circled the wagon. He had heard the sound and stopped, and he had found her. He sat on the porch with that thought, letting it settle into him the way the cold was settling into the ground. The difference between a life saved and a life lost was sometimes no more than a single step, a single decision to turn left instead of right, a single moment of attention. He had turned left. He had followed the sound. He had found her. And now she was inside, asleep under her mother's quilt, with her father's rabbit on the nightstand, and he was on the porch, keeping watch over a home that was no longer empty. He stayed until his hands were numb and his breath was white in the air. Then he went inside, banked the fire, and walked down the hall past her door. He paused, listening. Her breathing was slow and even. "Good night, Ellie," he whispered. He went to his own room, lay down in the dark, and slept without dreaming for the first time in as long as he could remember. The first real snow came in the second week of November, arriving not as a gentle dusting, but as a hard fall that buried the prairie in a single night. Luke woke to a world transformed, the fence lines nearly invisible, the barn roof sagging under the weight, the air so still and cold that sound carried for miles. He stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the white expanse, and felt the particular quiet that comes only after a heavy snow, a hush that seemed to press against the ears. Ellie came out bundled in a coat Mrs. Calloway had found for her, her boots laced twice to keep out the cold. She stood beside him, her breath puffing in small clouds. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "Some years worse," Luke said. "This is a good one." "Means the ground'll be wet come spring." She looked out at the white world with the same careful attention she gave everything. "I never seen snow like this. In Illinois it came and went. This feels different. It'll stay. Won't melt till March, maybe April." She nodded, accepting that, and then she walked off the porch into the snow, her boots sinking to her ankles. She stood in the middle of the yard, turning slowly, looking at the way the light moved across the white surface. Nobody bounded past her, his legs disappearing into the drifts, his tail waving like a flag. Luke watched her. The snow had changed everything. The shape of the land, the texture of the light, the way the world sounded. But it had not changed her. She was still the same steady, watchful girl, taking in the new thing with the same quiet attention she gave everything else. He finished his coffee and went to start the morning chores. The snow meant extra work, digging paths to the barn, breaking ice on the water troughs, checking on the horses, making sure the chicken coop was secure. Ellie joined him without being asked, carrying a shovel that was nearly as tall as she was, attacking the drifts with a determination that made him smile. By noon they had cleared the essential paths, and the animals were fed and watered. They came inside cold and hungry, and Luke made a stew from the last of the salt pork and some potatoes he had stored in the root cellar. They ate at the kitchen table, the fire crackling in the stove, the windows steamed from the heat inside. "Luke," Ellie said, setting down her spoon. "Yeah, I've been thinking about something. You do a lot of that." She gave him a look, the one that said she was not going to be distracted by humor. "I want to write to the families in Illinois, the ones Victor hurt." Luke leaned back in his chair. "You know how to find them?" "Thomas said he had names. He said there were 3 families. I want to write to them and tell them I'm sorry for what Victor did, and I want to offer them some of the money from the contracts." Luke looked at her across the table. She was serious, her chin set, her eyes steady. She was 8 years old, and she was trying to make right something that was not her fault, that had never been her fault. "That's a big thing to take on," he said. "I know. You sure you're ready for that?" She was quiet for a moment, turning her spoon over in her hand. "I think about them sometimes," she said, "the families. I think about what it would have been like if nobody had found me, if I'd been left out there. And I think about how Victor did that to other people too, not just us." She looked up at him. "I can't fix what he did, but I can try to help them the way you helped me." Luke sat with that for a long moment. The fire popped. The wind rattled the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle now, adding to the weight already on the ground. "All right," he said. "We'll write the letters together, tonight, if you want." She nodded, picked up her spoon, and went back to her stew. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with paper and ink, and Ellie dictated while Luke wrote. The letters were simple and direct, the way Ellie said things. She introduced herself as the daughter of Daniel and Margaret Carter, and she explained that she had recently come into possession of certain assets that had been the target of Victor Hale's schemes. She wrote that she wanted to offer financial assistance to any family that had suffered because of him. No strings attached, no repayment expected. She said she was sorry for what they had been through, and she hoped they were safe now. When they finished the third letter, she sat back and looked at them laid out on the table. "Do you think they'll answer?" she asked. "Some will, maybe all. People like to know they're not forgotten." "I hope they answer," she said. "I want to know they're okay." She folded the letters carefully, sealed them with wax from a candle, and set them on the mantel to send with the next mail wagon to Dry Creek. Then she went to bed, and Luke sat alone in the kitchen, looking at the sealed letters, thinking about the kind of child who, having been saved from the edge of death, immediately turned around to save others. He banked the fire and went to bed. The snow continued through the night, and by morning the drifts were deep enough that the front door would not open all the way. Luke had to push hard to get out, and he spent the morning digging not just paths, but a trench to the barn. The sky was gray and heavy, promising more snow to come. They settled into the winter rhythm. Mornings were for chores, afternoons for reading and lessons, evenings for sitting by the fire and talking or being quiet together. The world outside had gone still and white, and the ranch became an island, cut off from everything except the small, warm space they shared. Ellie continued to improve in her reading. She worked through the books Miss Arden had loaned her, sounding out difficult words with the same stubborn persistence she brought to everything. She asked questions constantly, about the stars, about the horses, about how the pump brought water from the ground, about why the wind made different sounds in different seasons. Luke answered as best he could, and when he did not know, he said so, and they looked for the answer together in the few books he owned. One afternoon, when the snow had paused and the sun broke through for a few hours, they went out to the barn to check on the horses. Caesar nickered when he saw Luke, pressing his nose against his shoulder. Ellie went to the mare Luke had bought at auction in September, a gentle sorrel named Daisy, and fed her a piece of apple from her pocket. "Can I learn to ride?" she asked. "Already know how. You rode with me." "I mean by myself, on Daisy. Can you teach me?" Luke looked at her, standing beside the mare, her hand on Daisy's neck, her face turned up toward him with that look she got when she was asking for something she really wanted. "When the snow clears," he said. "We'll start in the spring." She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to Daisy, talking to her in a low voice about all the things they would do when the weather turned. December came in with a cold so bitter that the air itself seemed to crack. Luke spent a full day splitting wood, stacking it under the lean-to beside the house, making sure they had enough to last through the worst of it. Ellie helped, gathering the smaller pieces and carrying them inside, building the fires herself under Luke's watchful eye. On the night of the first real blizzard, a storm that came howling out of the north, driving snow horizontal, reducing the world to a white roar, they sat in the kitchen with the lamps lit and the fire stoked, listening to the wind batter the walls. Nobody had refused to go outside and was curled on the rug by the stove, his nose tucked under his tail. Jed had claimed the chair nearest the fire and was watching the flames with the fixed attention of a cat who had decided that winter was an affront to his dignity. "I don't like this," Ellie said. She was sitting on the floor beside nobody, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them. The wooden rabbit was in her lap. "It's just wind," Luke said. "House has stood through worse." "I know. I still don't like it." He looked at her more closely. Her face was not afraid exactly, but it was tight, the way it got when she was holding something in. "Something on your mind?" She was quiet for a long moment. The wind howled. A shutter banged somewhere, and she flinched, just barely. "The night we left," she said. "The night we ran from Victor. It was storming. Not snow, but rain. Thunder." Papa woke me up in the middle of the night and said we had to go right then. Mama was crying. I could hear her crying in the other room while she packed." She paused, her hands tightening on the rabbit. "I didn't understand how bad it was until later. I just knew we were leaving everything. My toys, my bed, the dresser Papa had made for me. We couldn't take any of it." Luke listened without moving, letting her speak at her own pace. "Victor came to the house 2 days later," she said, "after we were already gone. The neighbor told Papa. He said Victor broke down the door and tore the place apart looking for papers. He didn't find them because Papa had already given them to Thomas. But he took everything else, everything we left." Her voice was flat, the way it got when she was reciting facts she had already made peace with. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "What he would have done if he'd caught us before we left." "He didn't catch you?" "No, but he came close. I remember looking out the back of the wagon and seeing lights behind us on the road. Papa pushed the horses harder. Mama held me and told me to close my eyes and pray." She looked up at him. "I don't like storms." Luke stood, walked over to the window, and looked out at the white fury beyond the glass. "Neither do I," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him with surprise. "You don't?" "After Sarah and James died, I didn't like anything that reminded me of the night they left. It was raining that night too." She was quiet. Then she said, "I didn't know that." "No reason you would." She stood and walked over to him, standing beside him at the window. They looked out at the storm together. The wind shook the glass, and the snow beat against it in waves, but the house held. "I think," she said slowly, "that storms are easier when you're not alone in them." Luke looked down at her. She was still holding the rabbit, her face lit by the lamp, her eyes on the white world outside. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's right." They stood at the window until the worst of the wind passed, and then they went back to the fire, and Ellie fell asleep on the rug with her head on nobody's side, and Luke sat in his chair and watched the flames and thought about all the storms he had weathered alone, and how different this one was. The blizzard lasted 3 days. On the third morning, the wind finally died, and the sun came out, and the world was so bright that it hurt to look at it. Luke dug a tunnel to the barn and found the horses stamping and restless but unharmed. The chickens had survived, huddled together in a corner of the coop. The pump had frozen, but he got it working again with hot water and patience. Ellie came out bundled in her coat, her boots tied tight, and stood in the yard, blinking in the brilliant light. The snow was up to her waist in places. She waded through it to the barn and checked on Daisy herself, talking to the mare in a low voice, making sure she was all right. When she came back, her cheeks were red and her eyes were bright, and she was smiling, a real smile, not the careful one she used most of the time. "We made it," she said. "We made it." She looked around at the white world, the drifts sculpted by the wind, the sky a deep and perfect blue. "It's beautiful," she said. "When it's over, it's beautiful." Luke nodded. He stood in the snow beside her, looking at the ranch that had been buried and had risen again. And he thought that she was right. The storm had passed. The sun was out. And they were still standing. That night they sat on the porch for the first time in days, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. The air was cold and still, and the snow on the ground reflected the starlight, making the world brighter than it had any right to be at night. "Luke," Ellie said. "Yeah, I want to do something." "What's that?" She was quiet for a moment, gathering herself. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden rabbit. She held it in her hands, turning it over once, twice. "I want you to have this," she said. Luke stared at her. "Ellie, that's your—" "I know what it is." Her voice was steady. "It's the most important thing I own. It's the last thing my father made for me, and I want you to have it." "Why?" She looked at him, and her eyes were not sad. They were clear and certain, the way they got when she had made a decision and was not going to be moved. "Because you're my father now," she said, "and I want you to have something that matters." The words hit Luke like a blow to the chest. Not painful, but stunning, the force of them. He looked at the rabbit in her hands, the small carved shape he had seen her hold every day since he found her, the thing she had clung to through thirst and hunger and grief. "Ellie, I can't take that." "You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you." her hands extended toward him. The rabbit sat in her palms, small and worn, smooth from years of handling. "It's not because I don't need it anymore," she said. "It's because I know I'm safe. I don't need to hold on to it the way I used to. I have you now." Luke's throat tightened. He reached out and took the rabbit from her hands. It was lighter than he had expected, worn smooth by her fingers, the paint long gone from years of holding. He held it in his palm and looked at it. "Your father was a good craftsman," he said. He was. Luke turned the rabbit over in his hands. He could see the detail, the careful shaping of the ears, the curve of the back, the small tail. It had been made with love, by a man who had known he might not be there to protect his daughter and had left her something to hold on to. "I'll keep it safe," he said. "I know you will." She leaned against his arm, the way she always did, and they sat in the starlight, on the porch of the ranch that had become a home, and the wooden rabbit was in Luke's pocket, and Ellie's hands were empty for the first time in months, and she was not afraid. The days shortened, the cold deepened, but inside the house there was warmth. And in the spring there would be riding lessons, and letters from Illinois, and a garden to plant, and a future that stretched out ahead of them, uncertain and bright, like the sun on the snow after a long storm. Luke sat on the porch with Ellie asleep beside him, and he touched the wooden rabbit in his pocket, and he thought about Daniel Carter, a man he had never met, who had carved a toy and hidden a future, and trusted that someone would find his daughter before it was too late. Someone had, and that someone was not going to let her go. Spring came slowly to the Montana prairie that year, hesitating at the edge of winter like a traveler unsure of the welcome. The snow melted in fits and starts, retreating from the lower ground first, then from the shaded hollows, then from the north-facing slopes where the cold held on longest. The roads turned to mud, and then to dust, and then to mud again. The grass began to show through in patches, pale and tired. And then one morning, Luke stepped onto the porch and the air smelled different, not of cold and stillness, but of wet earth and something green beginning. Ellie came out behind him, still in her nightgown, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She stood beside him and sniffed the air. "It smells like spring," she said. "It does." "Is the snow really gone?" "Most of it. There'll be more, probably. A last storm or two. But the worst is over." She looked out at the yard, where patches of brown grass were spreading across the white. Nobody was investigating a mud puddle with great seriousness, his nose an inch from the surface. "Good," she said. "I'm tired of being inside." She had been patient through the winter, more patient than Luke would have been at her age, but the restlessness had been building for weeks. She had read every book Miss Arden had loaned her, some twice. She had helped with every chore, learned to start the fire without being told, and memorized the names and personalities of every horse in the barn. She had written and rewritten a list of things she wanted to do when the weather broke. Ride Daisy, explore the creek, visit the schoolhouse in person instead of doing lessons by correspondence, plant a garden, build a treehouse in the oak by the fence line. It was a long list. Luke had looked at it and felt tired just reading it. But now the snow was finally retreating, and the world was opening up again, and he could see the anticipation building in her like water rising behind a dam. The riding lessons began on the first truly warm day, a Tuesday in early April when the temperature climbed above 50 degrees and the sun stayed out from morning until evening. Luke saddled Daisy and led her into the yard. Ellie was already waiting, barefoot in the grass, her boots set aside because she said she wanted to feel the ground. "You remember what I told you?" Luke asked. "Keep my heels down. Look where I want to go, not at the horse's head. Don't pull on the reins, just ask." "That's most of it." He helped her mount, adjusting the stirrups to her short legs. She settled into the saddle with the natural ease of someone who had been born to it, her hands light on the reins, her back straight. Daisy stood patiently, one ear swiveled back, waiting for instructions. "Walk her in a circle," Luke said. "Easy, let her feel you." Ellie clicked her tongue and squeezed gently with her legs. Daisy moved forward into a slow walk, circling the yard. Nobody followed at a respectful distance, his tail wagging, as if he understood that this was an important event. Luke watched with his arms folded. She had good balance. She was not gripping with her knees or tensing up the way beginners did. She moved with the horse, her body loose and responsive. He had seen grown men who rode worse after years of practice. "How's that feel?" he called. "Good," she said, "really good." She guided Daisy around the yard, then down the lane and back. The sun was warm on her face, and she was smiling, not the careful smile she used for strangers, but the real one, the one that had become more frequent over the winter. By the end of the week, she was trotting. By the end of the second week, she was posting, rising and falling with the rhythm, her face concentrated, her hands steady. Luke kept her on the flat ground, away from the rocky sections and the creek, but he could see that she was ready for more. "Can we go to the north pasture tomorrow?" she asked one evening, unsaddling Daisy with practiced hands. "Not yet. Give it another week." She did not argue, but she gave him a look that said she was filing the date away and would hold him to it. The letters from Illinois arrived on a Saturday, brought by a rider from Dry Creek who had picked up the mail from the stage. Luke saw the envelope in the rider's hand. 3 letters, all addressed to Ellie Carter in care of Luke Harper, Dry Creek, Montana Territory. And he felt a weight settle in his chest. He took the letters, thanked the rider, and stood in the yard looking at them. Ellie came out of the barn, wiping hay from her hands. She saw the envelopes in his hand and stopped. "They answered," she said. "They did." She walked over slowly, taking the letters from him. She looked at each one in turn, reading the return addresses, her fingers tracing the names. "Can I open them inside?" she asked. "Whatever you want." They sat at the kitchen table. Ellie opened the first letter carefully, using the edge of a butter knife to slit the seal, the way she had seen Thomas Alderman do with official documents. She unfolded the paper and read silently, her lips moving slightly over the harder words. When she finished, she set it down and looked at Luke. "They're okay," she said. "The first family, the Millers. They lost their farm to Victor. He got it through a fraudulent loan, but the federal marshals gave it back after he was arrested. They're farming again. They have 2 children, a boy and a girl." The wife wrote the letter. She said she cried when she read mine. She opened the second letter. This one was shorter, written in a shaky hand. She read it twice before speaking. "The second family, the Owens. The husband died 2 years ago. Not because of Victor, but it made things worse. The wife is living with her sister in Ohio. She said she didn't know Victor had been arrested. She thanked me for writing. She said it meant more than I could know." She set the second letter down and picked up the third. This one was different. The paper was heavier, the handwriting more formal. She opened it and read, and as she read, her expression changed. The openness faded. Her face became still, the way it got when she was processing something difficult. "Ellie?" Luke said. She did not answer immediately. She finished the letter, folded it, and set it on the table with the others. "The third family," she said slowly, "is the Barlows. They live in a town called Springfield. Victor took their land and their savings. He left them with nothing. The father tried to fight him in court and lost. They've been living in a boarding house for 2 years. The mother is sick. They have 3 children. She paused. "They don't want money." Luke waited. "They want to meet me," she said. "The mother wrote that she wants to thank me in person. She wants to know that something good came out of everything Victor did." Luke looked at the 3 letters laid out on the table, each one a thread connecting Ellie to people she had never met. People whose lives had been touched by the same cruelty that had taken her parents. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird was singing, the first robin of the season, perched on the fence post near the barn. The sound came through the open window, bright and insistent. "I want to go," she said. "I want to meet them. Springfield is a long way from here. I know. Would take days to get there, maybe weeks, depending on the trains. I know." She looked at him with those steady, measuring eyes. "I'm not afraid of the distance," she said. "I've been farther from home than Springfield, and now I know I have a home to come back to." Luke looked at her. This girl who had sat beside a broken wagon holding a wooden rabbit and asked if he was leaving too. She had come so far from that day. She had grown into someone who could write letters to strangers and offer help and want to travel across the country to meet them. "All right," he said, "we'll go, but we need to plan it. The ranch can't be left alone for too long." "I can ask Miss Arden if she'll watch the animals," Ellie said. "And Roy can check on the place. And we can take the train part of the way, maybe." Luke smiled. "You've already thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since I wrote the letters," she admitted. "I didn't know if they'd answer, but I hoped, and I wanted to be ready." They spent the evening planning. Luke got out a map, and they traced the route from Dry Creek to Miles City, then by train to Chicago, then south to Springfield. He calculated the time, the cost, the logistics. Ellie wrote down everything in a small notebook Miss Arden had given her, her handwriting careful and neat. Before bed, she stood at the mantel where she had placed the 3 letters, touching each one lightly. "Luke," she said. "Yeah, do you think Papa would be proud of me?" Luke walked over and stood beside her. He looked at the letters, at her small hand resting on the edge of the one from the Barlows. "I think," he said slowly, "that your father would look at you and see everything he hoped you would become. And he would be more than proud. He would be grateful." She looked up at him. "Grateful? Grateful that you turned out to be the kind of person who helps people even when you're still healing yourself. That's a rare thing, Ellie. Don't ever lose it." She did not say anything. She just leaned against his arm, the way she always did, and they stood together in the lamplight, looking at the letters that connected them to strangers who had become part of their story. The next morning, Ellie wrote back to the Barlows. She told them she would come. She told them she wanted to meet them, to see their children, to sit at their table and hear their stories. She said she would bring the wooden rabbit her father had carved for her, and she would tell them about Daniel Carter, who had measured land and loved his daughter and left behind a future that she was still learning to live into. She sealed the letter and set it on the mantel with the others. The journey to Springfield took shape over the following weeks. Luke arranged for Roy to check on the ranch, for Miss Arden to look after the animals. He sold 2 cabs to a buyer from Billings to cover the train tickets and set aside extra for the visit. Ellie packed a small bag, a change of clothes, the wooden rabbit, the letters, the notebook, a book she was reading. They left on a clear morning in late April, the grass green and the sky wide and blue. Nobody whined at the gate as they drove away. One Ear sat on the fence post and watched them go with the disdainful expression of a cat who did not understand why anyone would leave a perfectly good barn. The train ride was Ellie's first. She pressed her face to the window as the prairie unrolled outside, the endless sky, the occasional herd of antelope, the small towns that appeared and vanished like stones dropped into water. She asked about everything, how the engine worked, how the tracks were laid, how the conductor knew where to stop. Luke answered as best he could, and when he did not know, they made up answers together, laughing at the absurd ones. 3 days later, they stepped off the train in Springfield, Illinois. The air was different here, heavier, greener, with the smell of wet leaves and distant industry. Ellie looked around at the buildings, taller than any she had seen in Dry Creek, and the streets crowded with wagons and carriages and people moving in all directions. "It's big," she said. "It's a city." She took his hand without asking. They found a hotel near the station, a modest place with a clean room and a window that looked out over the street. Ellie stood at the window, watching the people below, her face unreadable. "Tomorrow," Luke said, "we'll find the Barlows." She nodded. She did not turn from the window. That night she had a dream about her parents. She told Luke about it over breakfast, her mother sewing, her father carving the rabbit, the 3 of them sitting at a table in a house that no longer existed. She was not sad telling it. She was matter-of-fact, as if she was reporting something that had happened a long time ago to someone else. "I think they were saying goodbye," she said, "not in a sad way, in a we're okay, you're okay way." "Maybe they were," Luke said. "Maybe." She finished her eggs, drank the last of her milk, and stood up from the table. "I'm ready." The Barlows lived in a narrow house on a street of narrow houses, each one pressed against the next like books on a shelf. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, but the steps were swept clean, and there were flowers in a pot by the door. Pansies, purple and yellow, carefully tended. Ellie stopped at the gate. She looked at the house, the flowers, the worn front door. "Should I knock?" she asked. "You came all this way." "Might as well." She walked up the steps. Luke stayed at the gate, giving her space. She raised her hand and knocked. The door opened. A woman stood there, thin, tired, with dark circles under her eyes and gray in her hair that should not have been there at her age. She looked at Ellie, and her hand went to her mouth. "You're her," the woman said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You're Daniel Carter's girl." Ellie nodded. "I'm Ellie." The woman opened the door wider. Behind her, 3 children appeared, 2 boys and a girl, ages ranging from about 4 to 10, staring at Ellie with open curiosity. "I'm Martha Barlow," the woman said. "Please, come in." Ellie stepped inside. Luke followed, ducking under the low doorframe. The house was small and cluttered, the furniture worn, but it was clean, and there was a fire in the hearth, and the kettle was on the stove. They sat in the front room. Martha Barlow brought tea and sat across from Ellie, her hands trembling slightly around her cup. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she said. "I hoped, but I didn't think." "I said I would," Ellie said simply. Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she started to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears running down her face, which she wiped away with the back of her hand. "Your father," she said, "tried to warn us about Victor. He came to our house 2 years ago when he was gathering evidence. He said Victor was going to try to take everything. He said we should put our papers somewhere safe." She shook her head. "We didn't listen. We thought we could fight it in court. We lost everything." Ellie sat forward. "I know," she said. "I lost everything too, but I found something else." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden rabbit. She held it out to Martha, who took it with trembling hands. "My father carved this for me," Ellie said. "He gave it to me on my 7th birthday. He told me it was to help me remember that he loved me, remember that he planned ahead, remember that I was never really alone." Martha turned the rabbit over in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn shape. "It's beautiful," she said. "He was good with his hands." Martha looked up at Ellie. "I don't understand," she said. "You're a child. You lost your parents. You have every right to be angry and broken and bitter. But you wrote to us. You came here. You want to help us." "Yes," Ellie said. "Why?" Ellie thought about it. She looked at the 3 children watching her from the corner, at the worn furniture, at the flowers in the pot by the door, someone's attempt to make a hard place a little softer. "Because I know what it's like to have everything taken from you," she said, "and I know what it's like to have someone pull you out of the dark. That happened to me, and I think you're supposed to pass it on." The room was very quiet. Martha Barlow set the rabbit down, reached across the space between them, and took Ellie's hands in hers. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you." They stayed in Springfield for 3 days. Luke watched Ellie move through those days with a grace that humbled him. She played with the Barlow children, helped Martha with the cooking, listened to the stories of what Victor had taken and what they had managed to keep. She did not offer a grand gesture. She simply wrote a letter to Thomas Alderman, instructing him to release a portion of the oil contracts to the Barlows, enough to secure a new start, a better house, a doctor for Martha's health. On the last evening, Ellie sat on the porch of the Barlow house with the eldest boy, a quiet 10-year-old named Samuel. They were talking about something in low voices, their heads together. Luke leaned against the gate, watching, not intruding. Later, on the walk back to the hotel, Ellie was quiet. "Everything okay?" Luke asked. "Yeah," she said. "Samuel asked me if I was scared when my parents died." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that I was terrified, that I thought I was going to die too, that I didn't think anyone would find me." She paused. "And then I told him about you." Luke did not know what to say to that. He kept walking. "He asked if I still get scared now," she continued. "I said yes, but I said it's different now, because I know someone will come for me." They walked the rest of the way in silence. Springfield was settling into night around them, the street lamps flickering, the sounds of the city growing distant. The air was cool and smelled of rain coming. At the hotel, before they went inside, Ellie stopped on the steps. "Luke," she said. "Yeah, thank you for bringing me here. You don't have to thank me for that. I know." "But I want to." She went inside. Luke stood on the steps a moment longer, looking up at the sky where the clouds were gathering, and thought about the strange paths that had brought them here. A broken wagon, a wooden rabbit, a man who had almost ridden past. He had not ridden past, he had stopped. And that stopping had led to this, a girl who had learned to pass on the grace she had been given. He followed her inside. The next morning they caught the train home. The journey back was quieter, the landscape scrolling past in shades of green, the sky wide and full of clouds. Ellie slept for part of it, her head against Luke's shoulder, the wooden rabbit in her lap. When she woke, she looked out the window and watched the prairie reappear, the familiar flat horizon, the distant mountains still capped with snow. "We're almost home," she said. "Almost." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I'm going to write to the Millers and the Owens, too. Not about money, just to stay in touch. I want to know how they're doing. I want them to know someone remembers." "That's a good idea." She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the window. They arrived in Dry Creek in the evening of the 5th day. Roy was waiting at the station with a wagon. "Place is still standing," he said. "Miss Arden fed the cat. Nobody only ran off once. Jed caught 3 mice." He looked at Ellie. "Welcome home." She climbed into the wagon, and they drove the familiar road to the ranch. The gate was open. The house was dark. But when Luke lit the lamp and Ellie walked through the door, she sighed, a long, slow breath, as if she had been holding it for the entire journey. "It's good to be back," she said. She went to her room, put the wooden rabbit on the nightstand, and sat on the edge of her bed, looking around at the space that had become hers. Luke stood in the doorway. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm really okay." He nodded and left her to settle in. That night, after she had gone to sleep, Luke sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark prairie. The stars were out, bright and close, the way they only were in a place with no city lights. He thought about the Barlows, the letters, the train ride, the girl sleeping in the room at the end of the hall. He thought about how different the world looked now compared to the day he had found her. He heard the screen door open behind him. Ellie came out in her nightgown, a blanket around her shoulders. She sat down beside him on the step. "Can't sleep," she said. "Me neither." They sat together in the dark, the way they had done so many times before. A coyote called in the distance, and the horses shifted in the barn. The wind moved through the grass, soft and persistent. "Luke," Ellie said. "Yeah, I want to plant a garden, a big one, with vegetables and flowers and maybe a tree. In the morning we'll start planting it." "Okay." She leaned against his arm, and they watched the stars until her eyes grew heavy and her breathing slowed. Luke carried her inside, laid her in her bed, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. The wooden rabbit was on the nightstand, its worn shape catching the moonlight from the window. He stood there a moment, looking at her. Then he went back to the porch and sat alone with his coffee until the stars began to fade and the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky. The garden grew faster than either of them expected. The seeds Ellie had planted in early May pushed through the soil within a week, and by the middle of June, the rows were thick with green, beans climbing the poles she had helped Luke drive into the ground, carrots with feathery tops swaying in the breeze, squash spreading broad leaves across the warm earth. Ellie visited the garden every morning before breakfast, checking each plant, pulling weeds, talking to the tomatoes as if they were old friends. Luke watched from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, and felt something he had not felt in years, a quiet contentment that did not ask for anything more. The ranch was thriving, the horses were healthy, the barn roof no longer leaked, and there was a girl in his garden, her hair tied back with a piece of twine, her hands in the dirt, humming a tune he did not recognize. She had begun to hum in the past few weeks. It was not a full song, just a fragment of melody that she repeated without seeming to notice. Luke never asked where it came from. He did not want to break the spell. The letters continued to arrive. The Millers wrote back, thanking Ellie for the money she had sent, enclosing a drawing their daughter had made of a house with a yellow sun above it. The Owens wrote less frequently, but each letter carried the same message. They were managing, they were grateful, they had not forgotten. Ellie kept them all in a box under her bed, tied with a ribbon. Martha Barlow wrote the longest letters. She wrote about the new house they had found, about the doctor who was treating her, about Samuel's progress in school. She wrote that she had started a garden of her own, inspired by Ellie's visit. She said that every time she looked at the pansies by her door, she thought of the girl from Montana who had reminded her that the world was not only cruel. Ellie read the letters aloud to Luke at the kitchen table, her voice steady and warm. When she finished, she would fold them carefully and return them to the box, and then she would go outside and stand in her garden, looking at the green growing things as if she was checking on them, making sure they were still there. One evening in late June, a rider came up the drive at dusk. Luke recognized the shape of the horse before he recognized the man, a lean bay with a white blaze, belonging to a deputy from Dry Creek named Wilkins. The deputy dismounted, touched his hat to Ellie, and handed Luke a folded paper. "From the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne," Wilkins said. "Came by the stage this afternoon. Roy said to bring it out to you direct." Luke unfolded the paper. He read it once, then again. The light was failing, and he had to squint to make out the words. "What is it?" Ellie asked from the porch step. Luke did not answer immediately. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Thank you, Deputy." Wilkins nodded, mounted, and rode back down the drive. Luke stood in the yard, watching the rider disappear into the gathering dark. "Luke," Ellie said. Her voice was careful, the way it got when she sensed something was wrong. "What is it?" He walked to the porch and sat down beside her on the step. He pulled the paper from his pocket and unfolded it, but he did not read it aloud. Instead, he said, "Victor Hale is scheduled for trial in Cheyenne in September." She did not flinch. She looked at the paper in his hands, then at his face. "That's not all, is it?" "No," he said slowly. "He's requested permission to write to you, to apologize, the marshal says. He's been asking for weeks. The marshal wanted to know if we would accept a letter from him." The silence stretched between them. A cricket started chirping in the grass near the fence. The last light was draining from the sky, leaving a deep purple that would soon be black. "He wants to apologize," Ellie said. Her voice was flat, not quite a question. "That's what the marshal says." She was quiet for a long time. Luke sat beside her, waiting, not pushing. He had learned that Ellie needed space to process things, and that pushing only made her retreat further. Finally, she stood. She walked to the edge of the garden and stood looking at the rows of vegetables, green and growing in the twilight. Her back was to him. "I don't want his apology," she said. "He killed my parents. He chased us across 3 states. He wanted to take everything from me. I don't want his words." She turned and faced him. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. "But I want him to know that I'm not afraid of him anymore. I want him to know that he lost everything. That I have a family now, and a home, and a garden, and he can't touch any of it." Luke stood and walked to her. "Then we'll write him back, not accepting his apology, just telling him the truth." She nodded slowly. "Can we do that?" "We can do that." They went inside. Luke lit the lamp, pulled out a sheet of paper, and dipped the pen in ink. Ellie sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. She dictated the letter slowly, choosing each word with care. "Dear Victor, I am writing to tell you that I am not afraid of you anymore. I was afraid for a long time, but I am not afraid now. I have a family. I have a home. I have a garden that I planted with my own hands. My father made sure that you could never take what was mine, and the people who love me made sure that you could never take me. I do not accept your apology. I do not believe it is real. But I want you to know that I am not hiding from you. I am living my life, and I will not let you take any more of it. Ellie Carter Harper." She stopped when she finished, looking at the words she had written. The last name, Harper. She had added it without thinking, without asking. Luke noticed, but he said nothing. "Is that good?" she asked. "That's perfect." She signed her name at the bottom, then pushed the paper across the table. "Send it." The letter went out with the next mail. A week passed, then 2. Ellie did not mention it. She tended her garden, read her books, helped with the chores. She did not seem to be waiting for anything, but Luke noticed that she had started carrying the wooden rabbit again. She had not carried it regularly since the day she gave it to him. She had kept it on her nightstand, a presence rather than a companion. But after the letter, she took to sliding it into her pocket again, her hand touching it sometimes when she thought no one was watching. He did not ask why. He understood. August came hot and dry, the grass turning brown, the creek shrinking to a trickle. Luke hauled water from the well to keep the garden alive, and Ellie worked beside him, her face streaked with sweat and determination. The tomatoes ripened on the vine, red and heavy. The beans were ready for picking. The squash had spread so far that it was encroaching on the path to the barn. One afternoon, when the heat was at its worst, they sat in the shade of the oak tree, sharing a canteen. Ellie had the wooden rabbit in her lap, turning it over and over. "Luke," she said. "Yeah, I've been thinking about something. About what happens after the trial." "What do you mean?" "Victor's going to prison. The marshal said he's probably going for a long time, maybe forever." She paused. "And I keep thinking about what happens after that, when it's really over, when there's no more Victor, no more court dates, no more letters." Luke waited. "What do we do then?" she asked. He thought about it. The question was simple, but the answer was not. He had been so focused on surviving, on getting through the hearing, on protecting her, on building a life that would hold, that he had not looked far beyond the horizon. "We keep doing what we're doing," he said finally. "We tend the garden, we ride the horses, we read books, we sit on the porch and watch the stars." She looked at him. "That's it?" "That's it." She considered that. Then she picked a piece of grass and put it in her mouth, chewing on it the way she had seen him do 100 times. "That sounds good," she said. They sat in the shade until the worst of the heat passed, and then they went back to work. September came, and with it the trial. Luke had been summoned as a witness. Ellie had not been called, and he was grateful for that. He did not want her in the same room as Victor Hale, not even with a judge and a jury, and a row of marshals between them. He left her with Miss Arden and took the train to Cheyenne. The trial lasted 4 days. He testified for half an hour, describing what he had found on the North Trail, the condition Ellie had been in, the bruises that predated the accident. The prosecutor asked careful questions. Crane, representing Hale, asked nothing, perhaps knowing that cross-examination would only make it worse. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on 7 counts, including fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced Victor Hale to 20 years in federal prison. Luke sent a telegram to Dry Creek. "He's done. Coming home." He arrived back at the ranch on a cool September evening, tired and hollowed out, but lighter than he had been in months. Ellie was on the porch with nobody at her feet. She stood when she saw him, and she did not ask what happened. She just walked down the steps and hugged him, her arms around his waist, her face pressed against his chest. "You came back," she said. "I always do." She stepped back, looked at him, and smiled. It was not the careful smile or the hesitant one. It was the full, open smile of a child who had been given news she had been waiting for. "I made supper," she said. "It's not very good, but I made it. I'm sure it's fine." They went inside. The table was set. There was a plate of biscuits, slightly burnt on the bottom, and a pot of beans that had cooked too long. Luke sat down and ate every bite without complaint. After supper, they sat on the porch. The stars were coming out, one by one. The air was cool and smelled of dry grass and the last of the summer flowers. "It's really over," Ellie said. "It's really over." She leaned against his arm. "What do we do now?" He looked out at the darkening prairie, at the ranch that was theirs, at the life they had built together out of wreckage and choice. "We live it," he said. October came in with a cold snap that caught everyone off guard. One morning the air was mild and the grass was still green, and the next the wind shifted north and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon. Luke had been meaning to reinforce the chicken coop before winter set in, but the sudden change caught him with the tools still in the barn and the repairs half done. He spent the morning boarding up the north side of the coop, hammering fast against the rising wind. Ellie brought him coffee and stood with her hands wrapped around her own cup, watching the sky turn gray and heavy. "Snow comin'?" she asked. "Not yet, but soon. This is just the front." She nodded and went back to the house. She had learned to read the weather over the months, the way the clouds stacked, the way the wind sounded in the trees, the way the animals acted before a storm. Jed had disappeared into the barn an hour ago, and nobody had curled up on the porch and refused to move. By noon, Luke had the coop secured. He was walking back to the barn to put away the tools when he noticed that the hinge on the main gate had worked loose again, the same hinge he had fixed in the spring. He muttered under his breath and turned back. It would take 10 minutes, and better to do it now than have it break in the middle of a blizzard. He propped the gate open, found the wrench, and started tightening the bolts. The wind was picking up, cold and sharp, cutting through his coat. He was focused on the work, his mind half on the hinge and half on the woodpile he still needed to stack before dark. He did not see the rider until it was too late. The horse came around the bend at a canter, moving fast, too fast for the narrow lane. It was a young mare, unfamiliar, and she was spooked by something, maybe the wind, maybe the loose tarp flapping on the fence. She saw Luke at the last second, veered hard, and crashed into the gate he was holding open. The impact caught him in the shoulder and sent him sideways. He stumbled, fell, and felt his leg twist under him in a way that made a sound he had never heard his own body make before. A wet, grinding crack that traveled up his spine and lodged in his teeth. The rider, a young man from one of the neighboring ranches, managed to get the mare under control and jumped down, his face white. "Mr. Harper." "I'm sorry, I didn't see you. She got spooked. Luke waved him off through clenched teeth. He tried to push himself up, and the pain hit him in a wave so intense that his vision went gray at the edges. He looked down at his leg. The angle was wrong. The bone was pushing against the denim from the inside, a lump that should not have been there. "Go get the girl," Luke said, his voice tight. "Get Ellie. Tell her to bring the wagon." The young man hesitated, staring at Luke's leg. "Now," Luke said. The man ran. Ellie came running down the lane, her coat half-buttoned, her hair streaming in the wind. She stopped when she saw him on the ground, and her face went through a series of changes. First shock, then fear, then a rapid practice settling into calm that reminded Luke of the way she had looked when he first found her. The face of a child who had learned to handle emergencies because no one else would. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Gait, horse, legs broken." She looked at his leg. She looked at the angle. She did not flinch. "We need to get you to town," she said. "I can't ride, can't even stand." She was quiet for a moment, calculating. "I'll take the wagon, but it'll take too long on the road. You need a doctor sooner than that." She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I'll ride Daisy to Dry Creek. I can make it in less than an hour if I push." Luke shook his head. "You can't ride that fast alone. It's too far and it's getting cold." "I can do it, Ellie. I can do it," she said again. Her voice was not loud, but it was firm. "You taught me. You said I was ready. I'm ready." He looked at her, this girl who had been afraid of storms and strangers and the dark, who had clung to a wooden rabbit like it was the only solid thing in the world. He saw something in her face that he had not seen before, not the careful bravery of a child trying to be strong, but the real thing. The thing that only came from having been through the fire and come out the other side. "All right," he said. "Go, but be careful." She was already standing. She turned and ran to the barn, and within minutes she was riding Daisy out of the yard at a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop down the road to Dry Creek. Luke lay on the cold ground and watched her go. The wind was picking up, and the clouds were lowering, and the first few flakes of snow began to fall. The ride to Dry Creek took Ellie 47 minutes. Later, she would tell Luke the exact time because she had counted every minute, every mile, every breath of the horse beneath her. She rode with her body low, her hands light on the reins, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The wind cut through her coat, and the snow stung her face, but she did not slow down. She thought about Luke lying on the ground, his leg twisted, his face gray with pain. She thought about her father, who had died because there was no one to help him in time. She thought about the wagon and the heat and the 3 days alone, and she pushed Daisy harder. She arrived in Dry Creek with the horse lathered and heaving. She slid off before Daisy had fully stopped and ran to Doc Harrove's office, pounding on the door until the doctor opened it, his glasses askew. "It's Luke," she said, breathless. "His leg is broken, bad. He's out at the ranch. I need you to come now." Doc Harrove did not ask questions. He grabbed his bag, called for his own horse, and followed her back. The ride back was slower, the snow falling thicker now, the light fading. Ellie led the way, her face set, her hands steady on the reins. They reached the ranch as the last light was dying. Luke had managed to drag himself to the porch, using the fence and his good leg, and was sitting propped against the wall, his face pale, his jaw tight. Doc Harrove knelt beside him, felt the leg, and let out a low whistle. "You're lucky," he said. "It's a clean break. Could have been worse." "Feels pretty bad," Luke said through gritted teeth. Doc set the leg, splinted it, and gave Luke something for the pain. Ellie stood in the doorway, watching, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not look away. When it was done, Doc packed his bag and looked at her. "He's going to need help for a while. Can't put weight on that leg for at least 6 weeks, maybe more." "I can take care of him," she said. Doc looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I believe you can." He left after promising to check back in 2 days. The snow was falling steadily now, blanketing the yard, coating the porch steps. Ellie banked the fire, made a pot of coffee, and brought a cup to Luke, who was propped up on the bed in his room with his leg elevated on pillows. "You did good," he said. His voice was hoarse, but his eyes were clear. "I did what you taught me." He took the coffee. "I taught you to ride. I didn't teach you to ride like that." She sat on the edge of the chair beside his bed. "I had to." He looked at her, this girl who had ridden through the cold and the dark to save him, who had not hesitated, who had not fallen apart. "You're not the same girl I found on that road," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, I'm not." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden rabbit. She had taken it with her when she rode, he realized. She had not left it behind. "I don't need this to hold on to anymore," she said, turning it over in her hands. "I have you, and I have myself." She looked up at him. "But I'm going to keep it anyway, because Papa made it. And because it reminds me that even when I was alone, I wasn't really alone." Luke did not have words for what he felt. He just looked at her, and she looked back, and the snow fell outside, and the fire crackled, and the house held them. "Thank you," he said, "for ridin'. You'd have done the same for me." "I would have." She stood, tucked the rabbit back into her pocket, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "I'm going to check on the horses," she said. "Then I'm going to make supper. You stay put." He smiled despite the pain. "Yes, ma'am." She left. Luke lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of her moving through the house. The clatter of the stove lid, the creak of the pump, her footsteps on the wooden floor. He thought about the girl who had once asked for permission to exist, and he thought about the girl who had just ridden like the devil himself was chasing her to save a man's life. The snow continued to fall. The wind moaned around the eaves, but inside there was warmth, there was a fire, there was a girl making supper, and there was a man who had, without knowing it, been saved right back. Spring came again to the Montana prairie, and this time it arrived without hesitation. The snow melted in a rush, turning the creek into a roaring brown torrent that carved new channels through the pasture. The grass came back green and thick, and the wildflowers appeared in patches, blue and yellow and white, scattered across the hillsides like paint spilled from a careless hand. Luke's leg healed slowly, the way a man's body heals when he is not as young as he used to be. He had spent the winter in a chair by the fire, his leg propped up, his hands restless. Ellie had taken over most of the chores, and she had done them without complaint, without once making him feel like a burden. She had fed the animals, hauled the water, split the kindling, and cooked every meal. She had read to him in the evenings from the books Miss Arden had loaned her, and she had sat with him on the porch when the weather permitted, watching the snow fall and the stars wheel and the slow return of the light. Now, in April, he was walking again. Not well. He used a cane, and his leg ached at the end of every day. But walking. He could manage the trip to the barn and back, and he had started helping with the lighter chores. Ellie still insisted on doing most of the heavy work, and he had learned not to argue with her when she set her mind to something. On a Saturday morning, with the sun warm and the air full of the smell of wet earth, Luke sat on the porch with a piece of wood in his hands. It was a block of pine, about the size of his fist, smooth and light. He had found it in the barn, part of a broken crate, and he had been working on it for weeks, a few minutes at a time, whenever his hands needed something to do. Ellie came around the corner of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been planting the garden, the same garden she had started the year before, now expanded to twice its size. She stopped when she saw what he was doing. "What's that?" she asked. "Nothing yet." She came closer, peering at the block of wood in his hands. It had begun to take shape, the rough outline of an animal, 4 legs, a long neck, a small head. She watched him work for a moment, his knife moving in careful, unhurried strokes. "Is that a horse?" she asked. "Might be. It looks like Caesar." "It's supposed to." She sat down on the step beside him, pulling her knees up to her chest. She watched him carve in silence, the way she used to watch him fix fence posts or mend harnesses. With the same quiet attention she gave everything that mattered. "Why are you making a horse?" she asked after a while. "Because I wanted to make something." He paused, setting the knife down and turning the carving over in his hands. "I wanted to give you something that I made. Not because your father's rabbit isn't enough. Because I wanted you to have something from me that you could hold on to." She was very still. He could feel her looking at his face, studying him the way she studied everything, searching for the truth beneath the words. "You don't have to give me anything," she said quietly. "I already have you." "I know, but I want to." He held out the carving. It was not finished. The legs were still rough, the head not fully shaped, but the intention was clear. It was a horse, standing with its head raised, as if looking at something far away. Ellie took it carefully, holding it in her palms the same way she had once held the wooden rabbit. She looked at it for a long moment, running her finger over the unfinished surface. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's not done yet." "I know, but it will be." She looked up at him and her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. She had stopped crying about the things that mattered a long time ago. She had learned to carry them instead. "I'm going to keep this forever," she said. Luke nodded. He picked up his knife and looked at the block of wood in his hands, the shape he was trying to find inside it. He thought about Daniel Carter, a man he had never met, who had carved a rabbit for his daughter and left her a future. He thought about the year that had passed since he found Ellie on that broken road, the fights, the fears, the hearing, the letters, the trial, the long winter of healing. And he thought about this. He had been a man who had stopped living. He had been going through the motions, waiting for the years to pass until they stopped passing. Then a child had asked him not to leave, and he had stayed. And staying had changed everything. "Ellie," he said. "Yeah. I want you to know something. When I found you, I wasn't looking for you. I wasn't looking for anyone. I was just riding a fence line, checking for breaks. I nearly rode past." She did not interrupt. She just listened, the horse carving held in her hands. "But I didn't," he said. "I stopped. And I don't know why I stopped. I could have kept going. I could have ridden back to town and let someone else handle it. But I didn't. I stopped. And I found you." He set the knife down and looked at her directly. "I think about that sometimes, how close I came to missing you. And I think maybe I was meant to stop. Maybe the whole time I was walking through those years of silence, I was walking toward that moment. Toward you." Ellie was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the grass, and a bird sang from the direction of the barn. Nobody came and lay down at their feet, his head on his paws, his eyes half closed in the sun. "I think about that too," she said finally. "About what would have happened if you hadn't stopped. If you'd ridden past, or if you'd found me too late." She looked down at the carving in her hands. "I think I would have died. Not right away, maybe, but alone. And I think that would have been worse than dying." "You didn't die." "No, I didn't." She looked up at him. "Because you stopped." They sat in the morning light, the carving passing from one pair of hands to the other, the day opening around them. The garden was planted. The horses were in the pasture. The house was standing, warm and full, waiting for them to come inside. Luke picked up the knife again and made another cut. The horse was taking shape, its neck curving, its legs becoming distinct. "Can I help?" Ellie asked. "You know how to carve?" "No, but you can teach me." He looked at her. She was serious, her face set in that familiar expression of determined attention. He handed her the knife, handle first. "All right, start with the legs. Take it slow. You can't uncut wood." She took the knife carefully and turned the carving in her hands, studying it from every angle. Then she made her first cut. Tentative, shallow, but true. He watched her work, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She carved slowly, the way she did everything, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that details mattered. "Like this?" she asked. "That's good. A little deeper on the next one." She carved another stroke. The shaving curled away and fell into her lap. "I think I like this," she said. "It's a good thing to know, a useful skill. I'm going to make something for you. You don't have to. I want to." She carved in silence for a while, the morning growing older, the sun climbing higher. When the horse carving was finally finished, the legs shaped, the head defined, the surface smoothed, she handed it back to him. "It's yours," she said. He looked at it. It was not perfect. The proportions were slightly off, and one leg was thicker than the others. But it was clearly a horse, and it was clearly made with care, and it was clearly a gift. "It's the best thing I've ever seen," he said. She smiled. Not the careful smile, not the hesitant one. The full, open smile that had become more common over the months, the one that reached her eyes and changed her whole face. "You're lying," she said. "I'm not." She took the carving from him and looked at it critically. "The legs are crooked. Horses don't care about crooked legs. They care about being loved." She laughed, a real laugh, bright and unexpected, the kind that came from somewhere deep and had been waiting a long time to get out. "You're strange, Luke Harper." "I know." She leaned against his arm, the way she always did, and they sat on the porch together, looking out at the ranch that had become their home. Nobody shifted at their feet. A hawk circled high overhead, dark against the blue. The garden was green and growing. "Luke," she said. "Yeah. I want to change my name." He turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" She was not looking at him. She was looking at the horizon, her face serious, her hands resting on the wooden horse in her lap. "At the hearing, I said you were my father, and I meant it. But my name is still Carter, and I want it to be Harper. I want to be Ellie Harper." The words settled into him, slow and deep, like water finding its level in dry ground. "You're sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything." He did not trust himself to speak for a moment. He looked out at the prairie, at the sky, at the land he had worked for 20 years, and he thought about how empty it had been and how full it was now. "We'll go to the courthouse next week," he said. "We'll make it official." She nodded. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. They sat that way until the sun reached its peak and the shadows shortened and the heat of the day began to build. Then she stood, brushed off her skirt, and picked up the horse carving. "I'm going to put this on my nightstand," she said, "right next to the rabbit. They'll be good company." She looked at him, and her eyes were steady and clear. "They will." She walked into the house, and Luke sat alone on the porch, the knife still in his hand, the block of pine now a horse, and a girl now a Harper. He thought about the road that had brought him here, the years of silence, the broken wagon, the child who had asked him not to leave. He thought about Sarah, who had loved him when he was young and whole, and James, who had been taken too soon. He thought about the hole they had left, and the way it had been filled, not with forgetting, but with something new. Some families are given, some families are made, and the ones that are made, built from wreckage and choice and the stubborn refusal to leave someone alone in the dark, those are the ones that last. He stood, using his cane for balance, and walked to the edge of the porch. The garden was green. The horses were grazing. The sky was wide and blue and full of promise. He thought about the girl inside, placing a wooden horse beside a wooden rabbit on a nightstand in a room that had once been empty. He thought about the name she would carry, the life she would live, the woman she would become, and he thought about the July day when he had not ridden past. He was still thinking about it when Ellie came back out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, weak, with a lot of sugar, the way she had learned to make it for herself. "I'm going to make a garden," she said, sitting down on the step. "A big one. And I'm going to plant flowers along the fence, so that when people ride by, they'll know someone lives here who cares about things. That's a good idea. And I'm going to learn to carve properly. Not just horses, other things, maybe a cat, maybe Jed. He'd be honored. She smiled, and the afternoon stretched out before them, long and gold and full of all the ordinary moments that make up a life. And that was enough. That was everything. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.